Part First, The Dead Command. Chapter 1. Rmajourcan Palace. Jaime Febra arose at 9 o'clock. Old Antonia, the faithful servant who cherished the memory of the past glories of the family, and who had attended upon Jaime from the day of his birth, had been bustling about the room since 8 o'clock in the hope of awakening him. As the light filtering through the transom of a broad window seemed too dim, she flung open the worm-eaten blinds. Then she raised the gold-fringed, red, damask drapery which hung like an awning over the ample couch, the ancient, lordly, and majestic couch in which many generations of Febras had been born and in which they had died. The night before, on returning from the casino, Jaime had charged her most earnestly to arouse him early, as he was invited to breakfast at Valdemosa. Time to get up. It was the finest of spring mornings. In the garden birds were singing in the flowery branches swayed by the breeze that blew over the wall from the sea. The old servant, seeing that her master had at last decided to get out of bed, retreated to the kitchen. Jaime Febra strolled about the room before the open window almost nude. There was no danger of his being seen. The dwelling opposite was an old palace like his own, a great house with few windows. From his room he could see a wall of indefinite color, with deep scars, and faint traces of ancient frescoes. It was so near, the street being extremely narrow, that it seemed as if he might touch it with his hand. Nervous on account of an important event which was to take place in the morning, he had passed a restless night, and the heaviness following the short and indifferent sleep led him to seek eagerly the invigorating effect of cold water. Febra made a sorry grimace as he bathed in the primitive, narrow, and uncomfortable tub. Ah, poverty! His home was devoid of even the most essential conveniences despite its air of stately luxury, a stateliness which modern wealth can never emulate. Poverty with all its annoyances stalked forth to meet him at every turn in these halls which reminded him of splendidly decorated theaters he had seen in his European travels. Febra glanced over the grandiose room with its lofty ceiling as if he were a stranger entering the apartment for the first time. His powerful ancestors had built for giants. Each room in the palace was as large as a modern house. The windows were without glass all over the house, and in winter they had to be closed by wooden shutters which admitted no light except that entering through the transoms, and these were studded with crystals cracked and dimmed by time. Lack of carpets disclosed floors of soft Majican sandstone cut in small rectangles like wooden blocks. The rooms still boasted the old-time splendor of vaulted ceilings, some dark, with skillfully fitted paneling, others with a faded and venerable gilding forming a background for the colored escutcheons which were emblazoned with the coat of arms of the house. In some rooms the high walls, simply whitewashed, were covered by rows of ancient paintings, and in others were concealed by rich hangings of gay colors which time had failed to destroy. The sleeping room was decorated with 8 enormous tapestries of a shade of dull green leaves representing gardens, broad avenues of trees in autumnal foliage leading to a small park where deer were frisking, or where solitary fountains dripped into triple basins. Above the doors hung old Italian paintings in soft brown tones representing nude, amber-hued babes fondling curly lambs. The arch dividing the alcove from the rest of the apartment suggested the triumphal order, its fluted columns sustaining a scroll-work of carved foliage with the softened luster of faded gilding, as if it were an ancient altar. Upon an 18th-century table stood a polychrome statue of St. George treading moors beneath his charger, and beyond was the bed, the imposing bed, a venerable family monument. Antique chairs with curved arms, the red velvet so worn and threadbare as to disclose the white woof, jostled against modern cane-bottomed chairs and the wretched bathtub. Ah, poverty! Sighed the heir of the estate. The old Febra mansion, with its beautiful unglazed casements, its tapestry-filled halls, its carpetless floors, its venerable furniture jumbled with the meanest of chattels, reminded him of a poverty-stricken prince wearing his brilliant mantle and his glittering crown, but barefooted and destitute of underclothing. Febra himself was like this palace, this imposing and empty frame which in happier times had sheltered the glory and wealth of his ancestors. Some had been merchants, others soldiers, navigators all. The Febra arms had floated on pennants and flags over more than 50 full-rigged ships, the pride of the Majican marine, which, after clearing from Puerto Pi, used to sail away to sell the oil of the island in Alexandria, taking on cargoes of spices, silks, and perfumes of the Orient in the ports of Asia Minor, trading in Venice, Pisa, and Genoa, or, passing the Pillars of Hercules, plunging into the fogs of northern seas to carry to Flanders and the Hanseatic republics the pottery of the Valencian Moors called Miolica by foreigners because of its Majican origin. These voyages over pirate-infested seas had converted this family of rich merchants into a tribe of valorous warriors. The Febres had now fought, now entered into alliances with Turkish corsairs, with Greeks, and with Algerines. They had sailed their fleets through northern seas to face the English pirates. And, on one occasion, at the entrance of the Bosphorus, their galleys had rammed the vessels of Genoese merchants who were trying to monopolize the commerce of Byzantium. Finally, this family of soldiers of the sea, on retiring from maritime commerce, had rendered tribute of blood in the defense of Christian kingdoms and the Catholic faith by enlisting some of its scions in the Holy Order of the Knights of Malta. The second sons of the House of Febre, at the very moment of receiving the water of baptism, had the eight-pointed white cross, symbolizing the eight beatitudes, sewed to their swaddling bands, and on reaching manhood they became captains of galleys of the warlike order, and ended their days as opulent knights commanders of Malta, recounting their deeds of prowess to the children of their nieces, being tended in their illnesses and having their wounds dressed by the slave women with whom they lived despite their vows of chastity. Renowned monarchs passing through Majorca would leave their sumptuous quarters in the Almudena to visit the Febres in their palace. Some members of this great family had been admirals in the King's Armada, others governors of far distant lands, some slept the eternal sleep in the Cathedral of La Valette beside other illustrious Majorcans, and Jamie had done homage at their tombs during one of his visits to Malta. La Lonja, the graceful Gothic structure near the sea at Palma, had been for centuries a feudal possession of his forefathers. Everything was for the Febres which was flung upon the mole, from the high forecastle galleons, from oriental cokers with their massive hulls, from fragile lighters, lateen-sailed settees, flat-bottomed taffuries, and other vessels of the epoch, and in the great columnar hall of La Lonja, near the Solomonic pillars which disappeared within the shadows of the vaulted ceilings, his ancestors in regal majesty used to receive voyagers from the Orient who came clad in wide breeches and red fezzes, Genoese and Provençals wearing capes with monkish hoods, and the valiant native captains of the island covered with their red Catalonian helmets. Venetian merchants sent their Majorcan friends ebony furniture delicately inlaid with ivory and lapis lazuli, or enormous, heavy plate glass mirrors with beveled edges. Seafarers returning from Africa brought ostrich feathers and tusks of ivory, and these treasures and countless others added to the decoration of the halls, perfumed by mysterious essences, the gifts of Asiatic correspondents. For centuries the Febres had been intermediaries between the Orient and the Occident, making of Majorca a depository for exotic products which their ships afterwards scattered throughout Spain, France, and Holland. Riches flowed in fabulous abundance to the house. On some occasions the Febres had made loans to their sovereigns, but this did not prevent Jamie, the last of the family, after losing in the casino the night before everything which he possessed, some hundreds of pesetas, from borrowing money for a journey to Valdemosa on the following morning from Tony Clates, the smuggler, a rough fellow of keen intelligence, the most faithful and disinterested of his friends. While Jamie stood combing his hair he intently studied his image in an antique mirror, cracked and dimmed. 36. He could not complain of his looks. He was ugly, but it was a grandiose ugliness, to adopt the expression of a woman who had exercised a peculiar influence over his life. This ugliness had yielded him some satisfactory adventures. Miss Mary Gordon, a blonde-haired idealist, daughter of the governor of an English archipelago in Oceanica, traveling through Europe accompanied only by a maid, had met him one summer in a hotel at Munich. It was who first became impressed, and it was she who took the first steps. According to the young lady, the Spaniard was the living picture of Wagner in his youth. Smiling at the pleasant memory, Febre contemplated the prominent brow which seemed to oppress his imperious, small, ironic eyes. His nose was sharp and aquiline, the nose common to all the Febres, those daring birds of prey who haunted the solitudes of the sea. His mouth was scornful and receding, his lips and chin prominent and covered by the soft growth of the beard and moustache, thin and fine. Ah, delicious Miss Mary! Their happy pilgrimage through Europe had lasted almost a year. She was madly enamored on account of his resemblance to a genius, and wished to marry him. She told him of the governor's millions, mingling her romantic enthusiasm with the practical tendencies of her race, but Febre ran away at last, before the Englishwoman should in her turn leave him for some orchestra director or other who might be an even more striking double of her idol. Ah, women! Jamie straightened his figure, which was manly, though the shoulders bent somewhat from his excessive stature. It had been some time since he had taken interest in women. A few grey hairs in his beard, a slight wrinkling around the eyes, revealed the fatigues of a life which, as he said, had whirled at full speed. But even so he was popular, and it was love that should lift him out of his pressing situation. Having finished his toilette he left the dormitory. He crossed a vast salon lighted by the sunshine filtering through shutters in the windows. The floor lay in shadow and the walls shone like a brilliant garden, covered as they were by interminable tapestries with figures of heroic size. They represented mythological and biblical scenes, arrogant dames with full pink flesh standing before red and green warriors, imposing colonnades, palaces hung with garlands, scimitars aloft, heads strewed over the ground, troops of big-bellied horses with one foot lifted, a whole world of ancient legends, but with colors fresh and vernal, despite their centuries, bordered with apples and foliage. As Febre passed through the stately hall, he glanced ironically at these treasures, the inheritance from his ancestors. Not one of them was his. For more than a year these tapestries, and also those in the dormitory, and throughout the house, had been the property of certain usurers of Palma who had chosen to leave them hanging in their places. They were awaiting the chance visit of some wealthy collector who would pay more royally, believing them to be purchased direct from their owner. Jamie was only their custodian, in danger of imprisonment should he prove false to his trust. Reaching the center of the salon, he turned aside, impelled by habit, but seeing nothing to obstruct his passage, he burst into a laugh. A month ago a choice Italian marble table which the famous knight commander, Don Priamo Febre, had brought back from one of his privateering expeditions had still stood here. Neither was there anything for him to stumble against farther on, the enormous hammered silver brazier resting on a support of the same metal, upheld by a circular row of cupids. Febre had also converted into cash, selling it by weight. The brazier reminded him of a gold chain presented by the Emperor Charles V to one of his ancestors which he had sold in Madrid years ago, also by weight, with the addition of 2 ounces of gold on account of its artistic finish and its antiquity. Afterward he had heard a vague rumor that the chain had been resold in Paris for 100,000 francs. Ah, poverty! Gentlemen could no longer exist in these times. His gaze was drawn by the glitter of some enormous writing desks of Venetian workmanship, mounted upon antique tables sustained by lions. They seemed to have been made for giants. Their innumerable deep drawers were inlaid in bright colors with representations of mythological scenes. They were 4 magnificent museum pieces, a feeble reminder of the ancient splendors of the house. Neither did these belong to him. They had shared the fate of the tapestries, and were here awaiting a purchaser. Febre was merely the concierge of his own house. The Italian and Spanish paintings hanging on the walls of 2 adjoining rooms, the handsomely carved antique furniture, its silk upholstery now threadbare and torn, also belonged to his creditors, in fact, whatever there had been of value in his venerable heritage. He passed into the reception hall, a cold, spacious room with elevated ceiling, in the center of the palace, which connected with the stairway. The years had tinged the white walls with the creamy shade of ivory. One must throw his head well back to see the black paneling of the ceiling. Casements near the cornice together with the lower windows lighted this immense, austere apartment. The furnishings were few and of romantic severity: broad armchairs with seats and backs of leather studded with nails, oak tables with twisted legs, dark chests with iron locks showing against upholstery of moth-eaten green cloth. The yellowish-white walls were only visible, as a sort of grille work, between rows of canvases, many of them unframed. There were hundreds of paintings, all badly done, and yet interesting pictures painted for the perpetuation of the glories of the family, executed by old Italian and Spanish artists who chanced to be passing through Majorca. A traditional charm seemed to emanate from the portraits. Here was the history of the Mediterranean, traced by crude and ingenious brushes: sea fights between galleys, assaults upon fortresses, naval battles enveloped in smoke. Above the clouds floated the pennants of the ships and rose the tower-like poops with flags bearing the Maltese cross or the crescents crinkling from the rail. Men were fighting on the decks of the ships or in small boats which floated near. The sea, reddened by blood and lurid from the flames of the burning vessels, was dotted with hundreds of little heads of men still fighting upon the waves. A mass of helmets and 3-cornered chomba hats mingled upon 2 vessels which grappled another where swarmed white and red turbans, and above them all rose hands grasping pikes, scimitars, and boarding axes. Shots from cannons and blunderbusses rent the smoke of battle with long red tongues. In other canvases, no less dark, could be seen castles hurling firebrands from their embrasures, and at their bases warriors almost as big as the towers, distinguished by 8 pointed white crosses upon their cuirasses, were setting their ladders against the walls to clamber to the assault. The paintings bore on one side white scrolls with the ends folded about coats of arms, on each of which was written in ill-formed capital letters, the story of the event: victorious encounters with the galleys of the Grand Turk or with privates from Pisa, Genoa and Vizcaya, wars in Sardinia, assaults on Bugia and on Tedeliz, and in every one of these enterprises a Febre was leading the combatants or distinguishing himself for his heroism, the knight commander Don Priamo towering above them all, he who had been both the glory and the shame of the house. Alternating with these warlike scenes were the family portraits. On the topmost row, crowding a line of old canvases depicting evangelists and martyrs in semblance of a frieze, were the most ancient Febres, venerable merchants of Majorca, painted some centuries after their death, grave men with Jewish noses and piercing eyes, with jewels on their breasts, and wearing tall oriental caps. Next came the men of arms, the sword-bearing navigators with short-cropped hair and profiles like birds of prey, all clad in dark steel armor, and some displaying the white Maltese cross. From portrait to portrait the countenances grew more refined, but without losing the prominent forehead and the imperious family nose. The wide, soft collar of the homespun shirt became transformed into starched folds of plaited ruffs, the cuirasses softened into jackets of velvet or silk, the stiff broad beards in imperial style changed to sharp goatees and to pointed moustaches, which, with the soft locks falling over the temples, served as a frame for the face. Among the rude men of war and the elegant caballeros, a few ecclesiastics with moustaches and small beards, wearing tasseled clerical hats, stood out conspicuously. Some were religious dignitaries of Malta, to judge by the white insignia adorning their breasts, others, venerable inquisitors of Majorca, according to the inscription which extolled their zeal for the spread of the faith. After all these dark gentlemen of imposing presence and metallic eyes, followed the procession of white wigs and of countenances rendered youthful by shaving, of coats resplendent with silk and gold, showy with sashes and decorations of honor. They were perpetual magistrates of the city of Palma, marquises whose marquisate the family had lost through matrimonial complications, their titles becoming merged with others pertaining to the nobility of the peninsula, governors, captain-generals, and viceroys of American and Oceanian countries, whose names evoked visions of fantastic riches, enthusiastic Botiflers, partisans of the Bourbons from the start, who had been compelled to flee from Majorca, that final support of the House of Austria, and they boasted as a supreme title of nobility the nickname of Butifarras, which had been given them by the hostile populace. Closing the glorious procession, hanging almost on a level with the furniture of the room, were the last Febres of the early 19th century, officers of the Armada, with short whiskers, curls over their foreheads, high collars with anchors embroidered in gold, and black stocks, men who had fought off Cape St. Vincent and Trafalgar, and after them Jamie's great-grandfather, an old man with large eyes and disdainful mouth, who, when Ferdinand VII returned from his captivity in France, had sailed for Valencia to prostrate himself at his feet, beseeching, along with other great hidalgos, that he re-establish the ancient customs and crush the growing scourge of liberalism. He was a prolific patriarch, who had lavished his blood in various districts of the island in pursuit of peasant girls, without ever sacrificing his dignity, and as he offered his hand to be kissed by some one of his sons who lived in the house and bore his name, he would say with a solemn voice, "May God make you a good inquisitor." Among these portraits of the illustrious Febres were a number of women, grand senoras with great hoops filling the whole canvas, like those painted by Velasquez. One of them, whose slender bust emerged from her flowered bell-like skirts with pale and pointed face, a faded knot of ribbon in her short hair, was the notable woman of the family, she who had been called La Greca on account of her knowledge of Hellenic letters. Her uncle, Fray Espiridon Febre, prior of Santo Domingo, a great luminary of his epoch, had been her teacher, and the Greek woman could write in their own language to correspondents in the Orient who still maintained a dwindling commerce with Majorca. Jamie's glance fell upon some canvases farther down, the distance representing the passing of a century, where hung the portrait of another famous woman of the family, a girl in a little white wig, dressed like a woman in the full skirt and great hoops of the ladies of the 18th century. She was standing beside a table, near a vase of flowers, holding in her bloodless right hand a rose as large as a tomato, looking straight before her with the little porcelain-like eyes of a doll. This woman had been styled La Latina. In the pompous style of the epoch, the lettering on the canvas told of her knowledge and wisdom, and lamented her death at the tender age of 11 years. The women were as dry shoots upon the vigorous trunk of the soldierly and exuberant Febre stock. Scholarship quickly withered in this family of seamen and soldiers, like a plant which springs up by mistake in an adverse clime. Preoccupied with his thoughts of the night before and of the contemplated trip to Valdemosa, Jamie stood in the reception hall gazing at the pictures of his forefathers. How much glory, and how much dust! It had been 20 years, perhaps, since a merciful cloth had passed over the illustrious family to furbish it up a little. The more remote grandfathers and the famous battles were covered with cobwebs. And to think that the pawnbrokers had declined to acquire this museum of glories under the pretext that the paintings were poor. Jamie was surprised that it should be difficult to turn these relics over to wealthy people anxious to pretend an illustrious origin for themselves. He crossed the reception hall and entered the apartments in the opposite wing. They were rooms with lower ceilings. Above them was a second story occupied in other times by Febre's grandfather. Relatively modern rooms, with old furniture in the style of the Empire, and on the walls illuminated prints of the Romantic period, representing the misfortunes of Atala, the love affairs of Matilde, and the achievements of Hernan Cortés. Upon the swelling dressing tables were polychrome saints and ivory crucifixes, together with dusty artificial flowers beneath crystal bells. A collection of crossbows, arrows, and knives recalled a Febre, captain of a corvette belonging to the king, who made a voyage around the world near the close of the 18th century. Purplish bivalves and enormous nacre-lined conch shells lay upon the tables. Following a corridor on the way to the kitchen, he left on one side the chapel, which had been closed for many years, and on the other the door of the archives, a huge apartment with windows opening upon the garden, where Jamie on his return from trips had spent many afternoons poring over bundles of papers kept behind the metal grating of many series of ancient bookshelves. He peeped into the kitchen, an immense place where anciently were prepared the sumptuous banquets of the Febres, who fed a swarm of parasites, and lavished generosity on all their friends who visited the island. Antonia looked dwarfed in this high-ceiled, spacious room, standing near a great fireplace which would hold an enormous pile of wood and was capable of roasting several animals at once. The ranks of ovens might serve for an entire community. The chill cleanliness of this adjunct of the palace showed lack of use. On the walls great iron hooks called attention to the absence of the copper vessels which used to be the splendorous glory of this conventional kitchen. The old servant did her cooking at a small hearth beside the trough where she kneaded her bread. Jamie called to Antonia to announce his presence and entered the adjoining room, the small dining room which had been utilized by the last of the Febres, who, being in reduced circumstances, had abandoned the great hall where the old-time banquets used to take place. Here, also, the presence of poverty was noticeable. The long table was covered with a cracked oilcloth of blemished whiteness. The sideboards were almost empty. The ancient china, when it became broken, had been replaced by coarse platters and jars. Two open windows at the lower end of the room framed bits of sea, of intense and restless blue, palpitating beneath the fire of the sun. Near them swayed rhythmically the branches of palm trees. Out at sea the white wings of a schooner approaching Palma, slowly, like a wearied gull, broke the horizon line. Mammy Antonia came in, setting upon the table a steaming bowl of coffee and milk and a great slice of buttered bread. Jamie attacked the breakfast with avidity, but as he bit into the bread he made a gesture of displeasure. Antonia assented with a nod of her head, breaking into speech in her Majorcan dialect. "It is hard, isn't it? No doubt the bread does not compare with the tender little rolls the Senor eats at the casino, but it is not my fault. I wanted to make bread yesterday, but I was out of flour, and I was expecting that the Pays of San Febre would come and bring his tribute. Ungrateful and forgetful people." The old servant persisted in her scorn of the peasant farmer of San Febre, the piece of land which constituted the remaining fortune of the house. The rustic owed all he had to the benevolence of the Febre family, and now in these hard times he forgot his kind masters. Jamie continued chewing, his thoughts centered upon San Febre. That was not his either, although he posed as owner. The farm, situated in the middle of the island, the choicest property inherited from his parents, that which bore the family name, he had heavily mortgaged, and he was about to lose it. The rent, paltry and mean, according to traditional custom, enabled him to pay off only a part of the interest on his loans, the rest of the interest due served to swell the amount of the debt. There were still the tributes, the payments in specie which the Pays had to make to him, according to ancient usage, and with these he and Mammy Antonia had managed to exist, almost lost in the immensity of the house which had been built to shelter a tribe. At Christmas and at Easter he always received a brace of lambs accompanied by a dozen fowl, in the autumn 2 well-fattened pigs ready to kill, and every month eggs and a certain amount of flour, as well as fruits in their season. With these contributions, partly consumed in the house, and in part sold by the servant, Jamie and Mammy Antonia managed to live in the solitude of the palace, isolated from public gaze, like castaways. The offerings in money were continually becoming more belated. The Pays, with that rustic egoism which shuns misfortune, became indolent in fulfilling his obligations. He knew that the nominal possessor of the estate was not the real owner of San Febra, and frequently, on arriving at the city with his gifts, he changed his route and left them at the houses of his creditors, or inspiring personages whom he desired to propitiate. Jaime glanced sadly at the servant who remained standing before him. She was an old paisa who still kept to the ancient style of dress peculiar to her people, a dark doublet with 2 rows of buttons on the sleeves, a light, full skirt, and the rebosolo covering her head, the white veil caught at the neck and at the bust, below which hung the heavy braid, which was false and very black, tied with long velvet bows. "Poverty, Mammy Antonia," said the master in the same dialect. "Everybody shuns the poor, and some fine day if that rascal does not bring us what he owes us, we shall have to fall to and eat each other like shipwrecked mariners on a desert island." The old woman smiled. The master was always merry. In this he was just like his grandfather, Don Horatio, ever solemn, with a face which frightened one, and yet always saying such jolly things. "This will have to stop," continued Jaime, paying no heed to the servant's levity. "This must stop this very day. I have made up my mind. Let me tell you, Antonia, before the news gets abroad, I'm going to be married." The servant clasped her hands in an attitude of devotion to express her astonishment, and turned her eyes toward the ceiling.
Santísimo Cristo de la Sangre.
It was high time. He should have done it long ago, and then the house would have been in a very different condition. Her curiosity was stirred, and she asked with the eagerness of a rustic, "Is she rich?" The master's affirmative gesture did not surprise her. Of course she must be rich. Only a woman who brought a great fortune with her could aspire to unite with the last of the Febras, who had been the most noted men of the island, and perhaps of the whole world. Poor Antonia thought of her kitchen, instantly furnishing it in her imagination with copper vessels gleaming like gold, dreaming of its hearths all ablaze, the room filled with girls with rolled-up sleeves, their rebosolos thrown back, their braids floating behind, and she in the center, seated in a great chair, giving orders and breathing in the savory odors from the casseroles. "She must be young," declared the old woman, trying to worm more news out of her master. "Yes, much younger than I, too young, about 22. I could almost be her father." Antonia made a gesture of protest. Don Jaime was the finest man on the island. She said so, she who had worshipped him ever since she led him by the hand, in his short trousers, walking among the pines near the castle of Belva. He was one of the family, of that family of arrogant grand seigneurs, and no more could be said. "And is she a good family?" she questioned in an effort to force her master's reticence. "Of a family of caballeros, undoubtedly the very best in the island, but no, from Madrid, perhaps. Some sweetheart you found when you lived there." Jaime hesitated an instant, turned pale, and then said with rude energy to conceal his perturbation, "No, Antonia, she's a Chueta." Antonia started to clasp her hands, as she had done a few moments before, invoking again the blood of Christ, so venerated in Palma, but suddenly the wrinkles of her brown face broadened, and she burst out laughing. "What a jolly master! Just like his grandfather, he used to say the most stupendous and incredible things so seriously that he deceived everybody. And I, poor fool, was ready to believe your nonsense. Perhaps it was also a joke that you were going to get married." "No, Antonia, I am going to marry a Chueta. I am going to marry the daughter of Benito Valls. That is why I am going to Valdemosa." The stifled voice in which Jaime spoke, his lowered eyes, the timid accent with which he murmured these words, removed all doubt. The old servant stood open-mouthed, her arms fallen, without strength to raise either her hands or her eyes. "Senor, senor, senor." She could say no more. She felt as if a thunderbolt had crashed upon the house, shaking it to its foundations, as if a dark cloud had swept before the sun obscuring the light, as if the sea had become a leaden mass dashing against the castle wall. Then she saw that everything remained as usual, that she alone had been stirred by this stupendous news, so startling as to change the order of all existence. "Senor, senor, senor, a Chueta, an apostate Jewess." She grasped the empty cup and the remnants of the bread, and ran to take refuge in the kitchen. After hearing such horrors in this house she felt afraid. She imagined that someone must be stalking through the venerable halls at the other end of the palace, someone, she could not explain to herself who it might be, someone who had been aroused from the sleep of centuries. This palace undoubtedly possessed a soul. When the old woman was alone in it, the furniture creaked as if people were moving about and conversing, the tapestries swayed as if stirred by invisible faces, a gilded harp which had belonged to Don Jaime's grandmother vibrated in its corner, Yet she never felt terror, because the Febres had been good people, simple and kind to their servants, but now, after hearing such things, she thought uneasily of the portraits hanging on the walls of the reception hall. How severe those seigneurs would look if the words of their descendant should reach their ears. How fiercely their eyes would flame. Mammy Antonia finally grew calm and drank the coffee left by her master. She had laid fear aside, but she felt profound sorrow over the fate of Don Jaime, as if he were in peril of death. To bring the house of the Febres to this! Could God tolerate such things? Then scorn for her master momentarily overcame her old-time affection. After all, he was nothing but a wild fellow, heedless of religion, and destitute of good habits, who had squandered what had been left of the fortune of his house. What would his illustrious relatives have to say? How ashamed his Aunt Juana would be, that noble lady, the most pious and aristocratic woman in the island, called by some in jest and by others in an excess of veneration, La Papaza, the Popess. Goodbye, Mammy. I'll be back about sunset. The old woman grunted a farewell to Jaime, who peeped into the kitchen before leaving. Then, finding herself alone, she raised her clasped hands invoking the aid of the Sangre de Cristo, of the Virgin of Luke, patron saint of the island, and of the powerful San Vicente Ferrer, who had wrought so many miracles when he ministered in Majorca, a final and prodigious saint, who might avert the monstrosity her master contemplated. Let a rock from the mountains fall and forever close the way to Valdemosa, let the carriage upset, and let Don Jaime be carried home on a stretcher by 4 men, anything rather than that disgrace. Febre crossed the reception hall, opened the door to the stairway, and began to descend the worn steps. His forefathers, like all the nobles of the island, had built it on a grand scale. The stairway and the zaguin occupied a third of the lower story. A kind of loggia in Italian style, with 5 arches sustained by slender columns, extended to the foot of the stairway, the doors of which gave access to the 2 upper wings of the building opening at either end. Above the center of the stairway, facing the street door, were the Febre arms cut in the stone, and a great lantern of wrought iron. On his way down, Jaime's cane struck against the sandstone steps, or touched the great glazed amphorae decorating the landings, which responded to the blow with the sonorous ring of a bell. The iron balustrade, oxidized by time and crumbling into scales of rust, almost shook from its sockets with the jar of his footsteps. As he reached the zaguin, Febre stood still. The extreme resolution which he had adopted, and which would forever cast its influence on the destiny of his name, caused him to look curiously at the very places which he had so often passed with indifference. In no other part of the building was the old-time prosperity so evident as here. The zaguin, enormous as a plaza, could admit a dozen carriages and an entire squadron of horsemen. 12 columns, somewhat bulging, of the nut-brown marble of the island, sustained the arches of cut undressed stone over which extended the roof of black rafters. The paving was of cobbles between which grew dank moss. A vault-like chill pervaded this gigantic and solitary ruin. A cat slunk through the zaguin, making its exit through a hole in a worm-eaten door of the old stables, disappearing into the deserted cellars which had held the harvests of former days. On one side was a well dating from the epoch when the palace was constructed, a hole sunk through rock, with a time-worn stone curb and a wrought iron spout. Ivy was growing in fresh clusters between the crevice of the polished rock. Often as a child Jaime had peered over the curb at his reflection in the luminous round pupil of the sleeping waters. The street was deserted. Down at its end, near the walls of the Febre garden, was the city rampart, pierced by a broad gateway, with wooden bars in the arch like the teeth in the mouth of an enormous fish. Through this the waters of the bay trembled green and luminous with reflections of gold. Jaime walked a short distance over the blue stones of the street which was destitute of sidewalks, and then turned to contemplate his house. It was but a small remnant of the past. The ancient palace of the Febres occupied a whole square, but it had dwindled with the passing of the centuries and with the exigencies of the family. Now a part of it had become a residence for nuns, and other parts had been acquired by certain rich people who disfigured with modern balconies the original unity of the design, which was still suggested by the regular line of eaves and tile-covered roofs. The Febres themselves, who were living in that portion of the great house which looked upon the garden and the sea, had been compelled to let the lower stories to warehousemen and small shopkeepers in order to augment their rents. Near the lordly portal, inside the glass windows, some girls who greeted Don Jaime with a respectful smile were busy ironing linen. He stood motionless contemplating the ancient house. How beautiful it was still in spite of its amputations and its age. The foundation wall, perforated and worn by people and carriages, was cleft by several windows with grilles on a level with the ground. The lower story of the palace was worn, lacerated, and dusty, like feet which had been plodding for centuries. As it rose above the mezzanine, a story with an independent entrance which had been rented to a druggist, the lordly splendor of the facade developed. 3 rows of windows on a level with the arch of the portal, divided by double columns, had frames of black marble delicately carved. Stone thistles climbed over the columns which sustained the cornices, while above them were 3 great medallions, that in the center being the bust of the emperor with the inscription Dominus Carolus Imperator, 1541, in memory of his passing through Majorca on the unfortunate expedition against Algiers. Those on either side bore the Febrer arms held by fish with bearded heads of men. Above the jambs and cornices of the great windows of the first story were wreaths formed of anchors and dolphins, testifying to the glories of a family of navigators. On their finials were enormous shells. Along the upper portion of the facade was a compact row of small windows with Gothic decorations, some plastered over, others open to admit light to the garrets, and above them the monumental eaves, such as are found only in Majorcan palaces, their masses of carved timbers blackened by time and supported by sturdy gargoyles projecting as far as the middle of the street. Over the entire facade extended cleats of worm-eaten wood with nails and bands of rusted iron. They were the remains of the grand illuminations with which the household had commemorated certain feasts in its times of splendor. Jaime seemed satisfied with this examination. The palace of his ancestors was still beautiful despite the broken panes in the windows, the dust and cobwebs gathered in the crevice, the cracks which centuries had opened in its plaster. When he should marry, and old Val's fortune should pass into his hands, everyone would be astounded at the magnificent resurrection of the Febrers. And yet, would some people be scandalized at his decision, and did he himself not feel certain scruples? Courage, forward! He turned in the direction of El Born, a broad avenue which is the center of Palma, a stream bed which in ancient times divided the city into 2 villages and into 2 hostile factions, Canamunt and Canaval. There he would find a carriage to take him to Valdemosa. As he entered the Paseo del Born, his attention was attracted by a group of people standing in the shade of the dense crown trees staring at a peasant family which had stopped before the display windows of a shop. Febrer recognized their dress, different from that worn by the peasants on the island. They were Avisans. Avisa. The name of this island recalled the memory of a year he had spent there long ago in his youth. Seeing these people who caused the Majorcans to grin as if they were foreigners, Jaime smiled also, looking with interest at their dress and figures. They were, undoubtedly, father, son and daughter. The elder rustic wore white hempen sandals, above which hung the broad bell of a pair of blue trousers. His jacket blouse was caught across his breast by a clasp, affording glimpses of his shirt and belt. A dark mantle hung over his shoulders like a woman's shawl, and to complete this feminine garb, which contrasted strongly with his hard, brown, Moorish features, he wore a handkerchief knotted across his forehead beneath his hat, with the ends hanging down behind. The boy, who was about 14, was dressed like the father, with the same style of trousers, narrow in the leg and bell-shaped over the foot, but without the kerchief and mantle. A pink ribbon hung down his breast like a cravat, a spray of flowers peeped from behind one of his ears, and his hat with a flower-embroidered band, thrust back on his head, allowed a wave of curls to fall around his face, brown, spare and mischievous, animated by African eyes of intense lustrous black. The girl it was who attracted the greatest attention with her accordion-plaited green skirt beneath which the presence of other skirts could be divined, forming an inflated globe of several layers which seemed to make still smaller her fine and graceful feet encased in white sandals. The prominent curves of her breast were concealed beneath a small yellow jacket with red flowers. It had velvet sleeves of a different color decorated with a double row of filigree buttons, the work of the Chueta silversmiths. A triple shining gold chain, terminated by a cross, hung over her breast, but so enormous were the links, that, had they not been hollow, they must have borne her down by their weight. Her black and glossy hair was parted over her forehead and concealed beneath a white kerchief tied under her chin, appearing again behind in long heavy braids tied with multicolored ribbons falling to the hem of her skirt. The girl, with her basket over her arm, stood looking at the strange sights, admiring the tall houses and the terraces of the cafes. She was pink and white, without the hard coppery roughness of the country women. Her features had the delicacy of an aristocratic and well-cared-for nun, the pale texture of milk and roses, lightened by the luminous reflection of her teeth and the timid glow of her eyes, under a kerchief resembling a monastic headdress. Impelled by curiosity, Jaime approached the father and son whose backs were turned to the girl and who were absorbed in contemplation of the show window. It was a gun store. The two Leviathans were examining the weapons exposed with ardent eyes and gestures of adoration, as if worshipping miraculous idols. The boy pressed his eager, Moorish face against the glass as if he would thrust it through the pane. "Fluxus, pa, Fluxus!" he cried with the excitement of one who meets an unexpected friend, calling his father's attention to the display of huge Leforcu pistols. The admiration of the two was concentrated upon the unfamiliar weapons, which seemed to them marvelous works of art, the guns with invisible locks, repeating rifles, pistols with magazines which could hurl shot after shot. What wonderful things men invent! What treasures the rich enjoy! These lifeless weapons seemed to them animate creatures with malignant souls and limitless power. Doubtless such as these could kill automatically, without giving their owner the trouble of taking aim. The image of Febra, reflected in the glass, caused the father to turn suddenly. "Don Jamie! Ah, Don Jamie!" Such was his astonishment and surprise, and so great his joy, that, grasping Febra's hands, he almost knelt before him, while he spoke in a tremulous voice. He had been killing time along the Paseo del Born so as to reach Don Jamie's house about the time he should arise. Of course he knew that gentlemen always retire late. What a joy to see him! Here were his children, let him take a good look at the Senor. This was Don Jamie, this was the master. He had not seen him for 10 years, but he would have recognized him among 1,000. Febra, disconcerted by the peasant and by the deferential curiosity of the two children who stood planted before him, could not recall his name. The worthy fellow guessed this slip of memory from Jamie's hesitant glance. Truly did he not recognize him. Pep Arabi, from Iviza. Even this did not tell much, because on that little island there were but 6 or 7 surnames, and Arabi was borne by a fourth part of the inhabitants. He would explain more clearly, Pep of Can Malorqui. Febra smiled. Ah, Can Malorqui. A poor predio in Iviza, a farm where he had passed a year when he was a boy, his sole inheritance from his mother. Can Malorqui had not belonged to him for 12 years. He had sold it to Pep, whose fathers and grandfathers had cultivated it. That was during the time when he still had money, but of what use was that land on a separate island to which he would never return? So with the geniality of a benevolent Grand Senor he had sold it to Pep at a low figure, valuing it in accord with the traditional rents, and conceding easy terms for payment, sums which, when hard times pressed upon him, had often come as an unexpected joy. Years had passed since Pep had satisfied the debt, and yet the good souls continued calling him master, and as they saw him now they experienced the sensation of one who is in the presence of a superior being. Pep Arabi introduced his family. The girl was the elder, and was called Margalida, quite a little woman, although but 17. The boy, who was almost a man, was 13. He wished to be a farmer like his father and grandfathers, but Pep had determined that the boy should enter the seminary at Iviza since he was clever at his letters. His lands he would hold for some good hard-working youth who might marry Margalida. Many young men of the island were already chasing after her, and as soon as they returned the season for the festegs, the traditional courtship would begin, so that she could choose a husband. Pepet was destined for a higher calling. He would become a priest, and after singing his first mass he would join a regiment or embark for America, as had done many other Avizans who made much money and sent it home to their fathers with which to buy lands on the island. Ah, Don Jamie, and how time passes! He had seen the Senor, still a mere child, when he spent that summer with his mother at Can Malorqui. Pep had taught him to use the gun, and to shoot his first birds. Does your lordship remember? It was about the time that Pep married, while his parents were still alive. Since then they had only met once in Palma, when they arranged the sale of the property, a great favor which he would never forget, and now, when he presented himself again, he was almost an old man, with children as tall as himself. As he talked of his journey the rustic displayed his strong teeth in mischievous smiles. It was a wild adventure of which his friends there in Iviza would talk a long time. He had always been of a roving and venturesome disposition, a vicious habit formed when he was a soldier. The master of a small trading vessel, a great friend of his, had picked up a cargo for Majorca, and had invited him just for a joke to come along. But it was risky to joke with him. As soon as the idea was suggested he accepted. The youngsters had never been in Majorca. In the entire parish of San Jose, in which he lived, there were not a dozen persons who had seen the capital. Many of them had visited America, one had been to Australia, some neighbor women talked of their trips to Algeria with smugglers in their felicas, but no one ever came to Majorca, and with good reason. They don't like us here, Don Jamie, they stare at us as if we were strange animals, they think we are savages, as if we are not all the children of God. And here he and his children had been subjected to the gaze of the curious throughout the whole morning, just as if they were Moors. 10 hours of sailing on a magnificent sea. The girl had a basket of lunch for the three of them. They would return tomorrow at break of day, but before sailing he wished to speak to the master on a matter of business. Jamie made a gesture of surprise, and listened more attentively. Pep expressed himself with a certain timidity, stumbling over his words. The almond trees were the greatest source of wealth on Can Mallorca. Last year the crop had been good, and this year it did not look unpromising. It was being sold to the padrones, who were bringing it to Palma and Barcelona. He had planted nearly all his fields to almonds, and now he was thinking of clearing and cleaning off the stones from certain lands belonging to the Senor, and of raising wheat on them, no more than enough for the use of his own family. Febra did not conceal his surprise. What lands did he mean? Did he really have anything left in Ibiza? Pep smiled. They were not lands exactly, it was a stony hill, a rocky promontory overhanging the sea, but he might cultivate it by terracing the steep slopes. On its crest was the Pirate's Tower, did not the Senor remember? It was a fortification dating from the time of the Corsairs. Don Jamie had scrambled up to it many times when a child, shouting like a young warrior, flourishing a cudgel of juniper wood, giving orders for the assault upon an imaginary army. The Senor, who had hoped for an instant in the discovery of a forgotten estate, the last one of which he might be the real owner, smiled sadly. Ah, the Pirate's Tower. He remembered it. A bold limestone cliff, in the crevice of which sprung up bushes and shrubs, the refuge and sustenance of rabbits. The old stone fortress was a ruin, now slowly crumbling under the stress of time and wind. The stones were falling from their places, the corners of the melons were wearing away. When Can Mallorca was sold, the tower had not been included in the contract, possibly through oversight because it seemed worthless. Pep could do as he liked with it, Don Jamie assured him. Probably he would never return to the place, forgotten since the days of his youth. When the peasant spoke of future remuneration, Don Jamie silenced him with the gesture of a grand senor. Then he glanced at the girl. She was very pretty, she looked like a señorita in disguise, the young fellows on the island must be wild over her. The father smiled, proud, yet disturbed by this praise. Come, girl, what should you say to the master? He spoke to her as if she were a child, and she, with lowered eyes, her face flushed, fingering a corner of her apron, stammered a few words in the Avisan dialect. No, I am not pretty. I am at your lordship's service. Febra brought the interview to a close, telling Pep and his children to go to his house. The peasant knew Antonia, and the old woman would be very glad to see him. They must eat with her whatever there was to be had. He would see them again about sunset when he returned from Valdemosa. Goodbye, Pep. Goodbye, children. He made a signal with his cane to a driver seated on the box of a Majorcan carriage, a light vehicle mounted upon 4 slender wheels, with a cheerful canopy of white canvas, and drove toward Valdemosa and the wealthy Jewess whose dowry was to recoup his fortune. Chapter 2. Bartering the ancestral name. Having reached the outskirts of Palma and the open vernal fields, Jamie Febra repented of his present way of existence. He had not been beyond the confines of Palma for a year, and he had been spending his afternoons in the cafes on the Paseo del Born and his nights in the gambling hall of the casino. It had never occurred to him to go forth where he might see the fields clad in tender green, the waters murmuring in the acequias, the soft blue sky dotted with white, fleecy islets, the dark green hills where stood the windmills swinging their arms upon the summits, the abrupt sierras forming a rose-colored background to a landscape which everywhere smiled and whispered sweetly, as in the days when it astounded the ancient navigators, causing them to name Majorca, the Fortunate Isle. When, thanks to his marriage, he should acquire a fortune, and could redeem the fine estate of San Febra, he would spend a part of the year there, as his forefathers had done, leading the healthy, rural life of a grand senor, munificent and honored. The horses were going at topmost speed and the carriage whirled past a string of peasants trudging along the road returning from the city. There were slender brown women wearing over their braids and white rebosolos broad straw hats with streamers and sprays of wild flowers, men dressed in striped drill, the so-called Majorcan cloth, their hats stuck on the backs of their heads like black or grey nimbuses around their shaven faces. Febra recalled the characteristics of the road although he had not passed over it for many years. He was like a stranger returning to the island after a dimly remembered visit. Farther on the road forked, one branch leading to Valdemosa and the other to Sollier. Ah, Sollier. Scenes of his boyhood rushed through his memory. Every year, in a carriage like this, the Febre family used to journey to Solier, where they owned an old structure with a spacious sagouin, the House of the Moon, so named on account of a hemisphere of stone having eyes and nose, representing the luminary of night which adorned the upper part of the portalon. They habitually went early in May. When the carriage rolled along a narrow pass high up in the Sierra, the little Jamie would shout with joy as he beheld, lying at his feet, the valley of Solier, the garden of Hesperides of the island. The mountains, dark with their pine trees, and dotted with little white houses, lifted their crests bound about in turbans of vapor. Below, surrounding the village and stretching down the valley as far as the sea, were orange orchards. Spring burst over the happy land with an explosion of color and perfume. Wild flowers grew among the rocks, branches of the trees were decked in waving green, poor habitations of the peasants concealed ruinous poverty beneath canopies of climbing roses. Rustic families from towns far and near gathered at the fiesta of Solier, the women in white rebosolos, heavy mantillas, and with gold buttons on their sleeves, the men in gay waistcoats, homespun woolen cloaks, and hats with colored bands. Concertinas whined, calling to the dance, glasses of native sweet wine and of wine from Banalbuffa passed from hand to hand. It was joy and peace after 1,000 years of piracy and of war against the infidel peoples of the Mediterranean, the joyful commemoration of the victory won by the peasants of Solier over a fleet of Turkish corsairs in the 16th century. In the port, the fishermen, masquerading as Mussulmans, or as Christian warriors, held a sham naval battle on their little boats, firing off blunderbusses and flourishing swords, or pursuing one another up and down the roads along the shore. In the church a festival was celebrated to commemorate the miraculous victory, and Jamie, seated in a place of honor beside his mother, thrilled with emotion listening to the priest just as he did on reading an interesting tale in his uncle's library in the second story of the great house in Palma. The inhabitants of Solier had risen in arms against Alaro and Bunala on learning from a boat which had come over from Avisa that a fleet of 22 Turkish galleots with many galleys was heading for their coast, threatening this the richest town of the island. 1,700 Turks and Africans, formidable pirates, attracted by the riches of the town, and drawn on by the desire to attack a convent of nuns, where beautiful young women of noble families lived retired from the world, had landed upon the beach. Divided into two columns, one marched against the Christians who had gone out to resist them, while the other, making a detour, entered the town, capturing youths and maidens, pillaging churches and killing the priests. The Christians realized the extremity of the situation. Before them were 1,000 advancing Turks, behind them the village in the hands of looters, their families subjected to violence and outrage calling to them in despair. They hesitated only a moment. A sergeant from Solier, a valorous veteran of the army of Charles V in the wars of Germany and against the Grand Turk, urged them on to attack the enemy. They fell upon their knees and invoked the Apostle St. James, and then attacked with their firelocks, arquebuses, lances and axes, devoutly expecting a miracle. The Turks faltered, then turned their backs. Their terrible chieftain, Suffere, captain general of the sea, an ancient Turk of great obesity, famous for his courage and daring, exhorted them in vain. At the head of his bodyguard, a squadron of Negroes, he attacked, scimitar in hand, felling a circle of corpses around him, but at last a native of Solier pierced his breast with a lance, and as he fell the invaders fled, even forsaking their standard. Then a new enemy barred their way. While trying to reach the coast and take refuge aboard their ships, a band of robbers that had witnessed the battle from their caves in the crags, seeing the Turks in retreat, came out to meet them, firing their flintlocks and brandishing their daggers. They had with them a troop of mastiffs, ferocious companions of their infamous career, and these animals, according to the chroniclers of the epoch, gave evidence of the excellence of the Majican breed. The troops under the command of the veteran sergeant turned back to the desolated village from which the looters fled as best they could in the direction of the sea, or fell decapitated in the streets. The priest became exalted as he related the victorious defense, attributing the greater part of the success to the Queen of Heaven and to the apostle warrior St. James. Then he eulogized Captain Angelatz, the hero of the day, the Cid of Solier, and also the valiant owners of Contamini, two women on an estate near the village who had been surprised by 3 Turks greedy to satiate their carnal appetites after long abstinence on the solitudes of the sea. The valiant donors, arrogant and strong, as are all good peasants, neither cried out nor fled at sight of these 3 pirates, enemies both of God and of the saints. With the bar used for fastening the door they killed one of them and then locked themselves up in the house. Hurling the corpse out of a window upon the assailants, they broke the head of another, and they drove the third off with stones, like true descendants of the Majican slingers. Ah, the brave donors, the forceful women of Contamini! The good people worshipped them as sainted heroines of the interminable war against the infidel, and they laughed tenderly over the deeds of these Joans of Arc, thinking with pride how perilous was the Mussulmans' task of supplying their harems with new flesh. Then the preacher, following traditional custom, brought his harangue to a close by naming the families who had taken part in the battle, a list of 100, to which the rural audience listened attentively, each nodding his head with satisfaction when the name of one of his forefathers was pronounced. This lengthy enumeration seemed short to many, who made a gesture of protest when the preacher ceased. There were others whom he did not mention, murmured the peasants whose names had not been read. All desired to be descendants of the warriors of Captain Angelatz. When the fiestas ended and Sollier recovered its tranquility, young Jamie used to spend his days racing through the orange orchards with Antonia, old Mammy Antonia of the present, who was then a fresh young woman with white teeth, full bust, and vigorous tread, widowed a few months after her marriage and followed by the ardent glances of all the peasantry. Together they went to the port, a peaceful, solitary basin, its entrance half concealed by a curving rocky arm of the sea. Only now and then the masts of some sailing vessel coming to take on a load of oranges for Marseille, appeared before this blue town with its surrounding waters. Flocks of old gulls, enormous as hens, fluttered with evolutions like a contredanse upon its glossy surface. The fishermen's boats came in at sunset, and beneath the sheds along the shore enormous fishes were left hanging, their tails sweeping the ground, bleeding like oxen, together with rays and octopuses from which dripped a white gelatinous slime like drops of palpitating crystal. Jamie loved this quiet port and its brooding solitude with religious veneration. Then he recalled the miraculous stories with which his mother used to lull him to sleep, the great miracle wrought upon these waters by a servant of God to flout the hardened sinners. Saint Raymond of Pennafort, a virtuous and austere monk, became indignant with King Jamie of Majorca, who was basely enamored of a certain lady, Dona Berenguela, and who remained deaf to holy counsels. The friar determined to abandon this recalcitrant, but the king sought to prevent his departure by laying an embargo upon all ships and vessels. Then the saint descended to the lonely port of Sollier, spread his mantle upon the waves, stepped upon it, and sailed away to the coasts of Catalonia. Mammy Antonia had also told him of this miracle, but in Majorcan verse, in a primitive romance that breathed the simple confidence of centuries which clung trustfully to the marvelous. The saint, having embarked on his mantle, set up his staff for a mast and his hood for a sail. Then a wind from heaven blew upon the strange vessel. In a few hours the servant of the Lord sailed from Majorca to Barcelona. The lookout at Montjuic announced with a flag the apparition of the prodigious craft, the bells of Scio rang, and the merchants rushed down to the sea wall to welcome the sainted voyager. Little Febre, his curiosity aroused by these marvels, was eager to hear more, and his companion called the old fisherman who showed him the rock where the saint had stood while invoking the aid of Almighty God before setting sail. An inland mountain which could be seen from the port had the form of a hooded friar. Along the coast, at an inaccessible point, a cliff seen only by fishermen resembled a monk kneeling at prayer. These prodigies had been formed by God, according to the simple souls, to perpetuate the memory of the famous miracle. Jamie still recalled the thrills of emotion with which he had listened to these tales. Ah, Sollier, the epoch of holy innocence in which he had first opened his eyes upon life to the accompaniment of miraculous stories and commemorations of heroic struggles. The House of the Moon he had lost forever, and also the credulity and the innocence of youth. Only memories lingered. More than 20 years had rolled away since he had pressed foot on the paths of forgotten Sollier. It now came back to his mind with all the smiling fancies of childhood. The carriage reached the fork of the road taking the route to Valdemosa, and all his memories seemed left behind, motionless by the roadside, growing hazy in the distance. The way to Valdemosa held no memory of the past. He had been over it only twice, after coming to manhood, having gone with friends to see the cells of the Cartuja, a once renowned Carthusian convent. He recalled the farmers' olive trees along the roadside, aged trees of strange, fantastic shapes which had served as inspiration for many artists, and he thrust his head through a window to look at them again. The ground was rising. Here began the stony, unirrigated ground, the lowest of the foothills. The road wound steeply among the ancient groves. The first olive trees now passed before the carriage windows. Febre had seen them, had often spoken of them, and yet he felt the sensation of something extraordinary, as if looking at them for the first time. They were black, with enormous, knotted, open trunks, swelling with great excrescences, and the foliage was sparse. These were olive trees which had stood for centuries, which had never been pruned, in which age robbed the sap from the branches to distend the trunk with the protuberances of a slow and painful circulation. The region looked like the deserted studio of a sculptor littered with thousands of shapeless bulks, with monsters scattered over the ground, upon a green carpet dotted with bluebells and marguerites. One of the trees resembled an enormous toad crouching ready to spring, holding a spray of leaves in its mouth. Another was a great coiled boa with an olive crest upon his head. There were trunks open like ogives, through the orifices of which shone the blue sky, monstrous serpents coiled in groups like the spirals of a Solomonic column, gigantic negroes, heads down and hands on the ground, the roots like fingers thrust deep into the soil, their feet in the air, grotesque stems with bunches of leaves springing from them. Some, vanquished by the centuries, were lying on the ground, sustained by forked branches, like old men trying to lift themselves with the aid of crutches. It seemed as if a tempest had swept these fields, overthrowing and twisting everything out of shape, and afterward turning them to stone to hold this work of desolation under a spell forever. Some trees standing erect, and having softer outlines, seemed to have feminine faces and figures. They were Byzantine maidens, with tiaras of dainty leaves and trailing vestments of wood. Others were ferocious idols with protruding eyes and long flowing beards, fetishes of gloomy, barbaric cults capable of checking primitive humanity in its progress, forcing it to its knees with emotion as if at a meeting with divinity. In the calm of this frenzied, but motionless distortion, in the solitude of these fields peopled by startling and eternal specters, birds were singing, wild flowers crept to the foot of the worm-eaten trunks, and ants came and went, an infinite rosary, burrowing in the ancient roots like indefatigable miners. Gustave Doré, according to report, had sketched his most fantastic conceptions in these olive orchards, steeped in the mysteries of centuries. Recollection of this artist recalled to Jamie's mind others more celebrated who had also passed along this road, and had lived and suffered in Valdemosa. Twice he had visited the Cartouche Amélie to see the places immortalized by the sad and unhealthy love of a pair of famous persons. His grandfather had often told him of the Frenchwoman of Valdemosa and her companion, the musician. One day the inhabitants of Majorca and the people of the peninsula who had taken refuge on the island, fleeing from the horrors of civil war, saw a strange couple disembark, accompanied by a boy and girl. It was in 1838. When their luggage was landed, the islanders were astounded by an enormous piano, an arid instrument of which but few were to be seen in those days. The piano was held in the custom house while the tangle of certain administrative scruples was unraveled, and the travelers sought lodging at an inn, and later rented the estate of Son Vent, in the environs of Palma. The man seemed to be ill. He was younger than the woman, but wasted by suffering, pale, with the transparent pallor of the consecrated wafer, his limpid eyes glowing with fever, his narrow chest shaken by harsh and continuous coughing. A fine, silky beard shaded his cheeks, a black, shaggy head of hair like a lion's mane crowned his forehead and hung down behind in a cascade of curls. She was strong and vigorous and did all the work of the house like a good bourgeoise, more willing than skilled in such labors. She played with her children like a girl, and her kindly, smiling face clouded only when she heard the cough of the beloved invalid. An atmosphere of exotism, of irregular existence, of protest against conventional custom, seemed to surround this vagabond family. She dressed in fantastic gowns, and wore a silver dagger thrust in her hair, a romantic ornament which scandalized the pious Majorcan dames. Besides, she did not go to mass in the city, nor make calls. She did not go out of her house except to play with her children or to entice the poor consumptive out into the sunshine, leaning on her arm. The children were as extraordinary as the mother. The girl went dressed like a boy that she might run with greater freedom. Soon island curiosity ferreted out the names of these strangers of alarming peculiarities. She was a French woman, a writer of books. Aurore Dupin, the illustrious Baroness Dudevant, separated from her husband, who made a worldwide reputation through her novels, which she signed with a masculine given name, and the surname of a political assassin, George Sand. The man was a Polish musician, a delicate constitution, who seemed to leave a portion of his existence in each one of his works, and who felt himself dying at 29 years of age. He was called Frédéric François Chopin. The children belonged to the novelist, who was about 35. Majorcan society, bound up in its traditional preoccupations, like a mollusk in its shell, and hostile by instinct to impious novelties from Paris, waxed indignant over this scandal. They were not married, and she wrote novels which startled respectable people by their audacity. Feminine curiosity wished to read them, but only Don Horatio Febre, Jamie's grandfather, received books in Majorca, and the small volumes of Indiana and Lelia, belonging to him, passed from hand to hand without being understood by their readers. A married woman who wrote books and lived with a man who was not her husband. Dona Elvira, Jamie's grandmother, a señora from Mexico, whose portrait he had so often seen, and whom he imagined always dressed in white with her eyes turned heavenward and her gilded harp between her knees, called upon the retiring woman at Sun Vent. She enjoyed overwhelming the ladies of the island who did not know French with the superiority of the foreigner. She listened to the novelist's lyric eulogies of the originality of this African landscape, with its little white houses, spiny cacti, slender palms, and aged olive trees, in such striking contrast to the harmonious order of the broad fields of France. Then Dona Elvira, in the social gatherings at Palma, defended the authoress with fervor, a poor emotional woman, whose everyday life was more like that of a sister of charity, more full of care and sorrow than of passion and pleasure. The grandfather took it upon himself to intervene and prohibit his wife's calls in order to quiet neighborhood gossip. The scandalous pair was completely ostracized. While the children were frolicking like young savages in the fields with their mother, the sick man sat at his dormitory window, or peeped out of his doorway, seeking a ray of sunshine. In the small hours of the night came the visit of the muse, and the man, sick and melancholy, seated himself at the piano, where, coughing and moaning, out of the bitterness of his spirit he improvised his voluptuous music. The owner of the estate of Sun Vent, a bourgeois of the city, ordered the foreigners to move, as if they were a band of gypsies. The pianist was a consumptive and the landlord did not wish to have his property infected. Where should they go? To return to their own country would be difficult since it was in the middle of winter, and Chopin trembled like a forsaken bird, thinking of the chill of Paris. He loved the island, despite the inhospitable people, because of the suavity of its climate. The Cartuja of Valdemosa offered itself as their sole refuge, a building devoid of architectural beauty, with no other charm than that of its medieval antiquity, situated in the mountains with pine-covered slopes, having, like delicate curtains tempering the sun's ardor, plantations of almond and palm, through the branches of which the eye could make out the green plain and the distant sea. It was a monument almost in ruins, a monastery suggesting melodrama, gloomy and mysterious, in the cloisters of which camped vagabonds and beggars. To enter it one must cross the old cemetery of the friars with its graves disturbed by the roots of forest trees thrusting bones up to the very surface. On moonlight nights a white phantom stalked through the cloisters, the shade of a wicked friar who haunted the place of his misdeeds, while awaiting the hour of redemption. Thither went the fugitives one stormy winter day, buffeted by wind and rain, traveling along the same route which Febvre now followed, but by an old road which barely deserved the name. The wagons of the caravan climbed, as George Sand said, with one wheel on the mountain and the other in the bed of a gully. The musician, wrapped in his cape, sat trembling and coughing under the canvas cover, throbbing with pain as the vehicle jolted over the rough ground. The novelist herself followed on foot. Over the worst places, leading her children by the hand on this vagabond journey. They spent the entire winter in the isolation of the Cartuja. She, wearing Turkish slippers, the little dagger always thrust into her ill-combed hair, courageously did the cooking with the assistance of a young peasant girl who took advantage of every opportunity to gorge herself with the dainties intended for the beloved invalid. The urchins of Valdemosa stoned the little French children, calling them Moors and disbelievers in God. The women cheated the mother when they sold her provisions, and moreover they dubbed her the witch. They all made the sign of the cross when they met these gypsies, who dared to live in a cell at the monastery, neighbors to the dead, in constant communication with the spectral friar who stalked through the cloister. By day, while the invalid was resting, George Sand prepared the broth, and with her slender, white, artistic hands, helped the maidservant to peel the vegetables. Then, with her two children she would race down to the abrupt, tree-covered beach of Miramar where Ramon Lull had established his school of Oriental study. Only at the approach of night did her real existence begin. Then the great gloomy cloister vibrated with mysterious music which seemed to float in from afar through the heavy walls. It was Chopin, bending over the piano composing his nocturnes. The novelist, by the light of the candle was writing Spiridion, the story of the monk who finally forsook his faith, but frequently she laid aside her work to rush to the musician's side and give him medicine, alarmed at the frequency of his cough. On moonlight nights, tempted by the thrill of the mysterious, in a voluptuosity of fear, she stole out into the cloister where the darkness was pierced by the milky spots of the window panes. Nobody. Then she would sit down in the monk's cemetery vainly awaiting the apparition of the ghostly friar to enliven her monotonous existence with a novel adventure. One night during carnival season Cartuja was invaded by Moors. They were young men from Palma, who, after having overrun the town disguised as Berbers, thought of the French woman, ashamed, no doubt, at the isolation in which she was held by the townspeople. They arrived at midnight, with their songs and guitars breaking the mysterious calm of the monastery, frightening away the birds perched in the ruins. In one corner of the cell they danced Spanish dances which Chopin watched attentively with his fever-lighted eyes, while the novelist flitted from group to group, experiencing the simple joy of the bourgeoise at finding herself not forgotten. This was her single happy night in Majorca. Afterward, with the return of spring, the beloved invalid felt relief and they began a leisurely return to Paris. They were birds of passage, who, after wintering on this fortunate isle, left no other trace than an undying tradition. Jamie could not even find out with certainty which room she had occupied. The changes which had taken place in the monastery had obliterated every vestige. Many families from Palma now spent the summer at Cartuja, transforming the cells into handsome apartments, and each one wished it to be understood that his was the one which had been occupied by George Sand, she who had been defamed and ostracized by their grandmothers. Febre had visited the monastery with a nonagenarian, who had been one of the youths that had gone dressed as Moors to serenade the Frenchwoman. He could not remember any details nor could he even recognize her room. Don Horatio's grandson experienced a kind of retrospective affection for that extraordinary woman. He imagined her as she appeared in her youthful pictures, with expressionless face and deep enigmatic eyes beneath fluffy hair, with no other decoration than a rose over one temple. Poor George Sand. Love had been for her like the ancient Sphinx. Each time that she ventured to interrogate it she had felt its merciless blow upon her heart. She had tasted all love's abnegations and perversities. The capricious woman of the Venetian nights, the unfaithful companion of de Musset, was the same nurse who cooked the meals and prepared the cough syrups for the dying Chopin in the solitudes of Valdemosa. If only Jamie had known a woman like that, a woman who combined within herself the natures of 1,000 women, with all their infinite feminine variety of sweetness and cruelty. To be loved by a superior woman upon whom he could impose his masculine will, and who at the same time would inspire him with respect for her was his dream. Febre sat as if stupefied by this thought, staring at the landscape without seeing it. Then he smiled ironically, as if realizing his own insignificance. The object of his journey flashed across his mind, and he pitied himself. He, who had been dreaming of a grand, unselfish, extraordinary love, was on his way to sell himself, offering his hand and his name to a woman whom he had barely seen, to contract an alliance which would scandalize the whole island. Worthy end to a useless, unbridled life. The emptiness of his existence was revealed to him clearly now, stripped of the deceptions of personal vanity, as he had never seen it before. The nearness of his sacrifice stirred him to relive the past in his memory, as if seeking justification for his present acts. What purpose had been served by his passing through the world? He returned again to the childhood recollections which had been evoked on the road to Solier. He imagined himself in the venerable Febre mansion with his parents and his grandfather. He was an only son. His mother, a pale lady of melancholy beauty, had been left an invalid as the result of his birth. Don Horatio lived in the second story, in the company of an old servant, as if he were a guest in the house, mingling with the family or isolating himself according to caprice. Jamie, in the midst of his childhood recollections, beheld his grandfather's figure in prominent relief. Never had he surprised a smile on that white-bearded face, which contrasted with his dark and imperious eyes. The members of the household were prohibited from ascending to his apartments. No one had ever seen him except when in street dress, which was always scrupulously neat. His grandson, who was the only one allowed in his dormitory at all hours, found him early in the morning in his blue coat with high, pointed collar and a black stock folded around his neck, ornamented with an enormous pearl. He maintained this correct old-time elegance until overtaken by illness. Whenever sickness compelled him to keep his bed he would give orders to his servant not to admit even his son. Jamie used to pass many hours seated at his grandfather's feet, listening to his tales, and at the same time awed by the enormous number of books which overflowed the bookcases and littered the tables and chairs. He found him ever the same, wearing his coat lined with red silk, which seemed changeless, but which was renewed, nevertheless, once every 6 months. The seasons brought no other variation than that of converting the velvet winter waistcoat into another of embroidered silk. His pride was centered chiefly upon his linen and his books. He ordered from abroad dozens of shirts which frequently lay in the bottom of the clothes press forgotten and yellowing and never worn. The booksellers of Paris sent him enormous packages of recent volumes, and in view of his unceasing orders added, "Bookseller," to the address, a title which Don Horatio displayed with playful satisfaction. He talked to the last of the Febres with grandfatherly kindness, trying to make him understand his tales, despite the fact that he was sparing of words and showed little patience in his relations with the rest of the family. He told of his journeys to Paris, and to London, sometimes in a sailing vessel as far as Marseille and then by post-chaise, again by steam engines along iron roadways, great inventions the infancy of which he had seen. He told of society at the court of Louis Philippe, of the great beginnings of the Romanticist movement in which he had taken part, and he told of the barricades thrown up in the streets which he had watched from his room, not mentioning that, at the same time, his arm was encircling the waist of a grisette peeping out of the window beside him. His grandson, he would say, had been born in a glorious epoch, the best of all. Don Horatio recollected the disagreements with his terrible father that had compelled him to travel through Europe. That caballero who had gone out to meet King Ferdinand, to ask him for the re-establishment of ancient usages, and who blessed his sons, saying, "May God make you a good inquisitor." Then he would display before Jamie great books containing views of splendid capitals in which he had lived, and which to the boy seemed like cities beheld in a dream. Sometimes he would remain lost in contemplation of the picture of the grandmother with the harp, his wife, the interesting Dona Elvira, the same canvas which now hung in the reception hall among the other ladies of the family. He did not seem moved, he maintained the same grave demeanor which accompanied the jests to which he was addicted and the coarse words with which he sprinkled his conversations, but he said in a somewhat tremulous voice, "Your grandmother was a great lady, with the soul of an angel, an artist. I seemed like a barbarian beside her. She was one of our family, but she came from Mexico to marry me. Her father was a seafaring man, and he stayed over there with the insurgents. There is no one in all our race who resembles her." At 11:30 in the morning he would dismiss his grandson, and putting on his tall hat, black silk in winter and beaver in summer, he would sally forth to take a stroll along the streets of Palma, always through the same locality and along identical pavements, rain or shine, insensible to cold and to heat, wearing his frock coat in every weather, continuing on his way with the regularity of a clock automaton which steps out, travels his little course, and then conceals himself at the stroke of certain hours. Only once in 30 years had he varied his route through the white and deserted sunny streets. One morning he had heard a woman's voice issuing from the interior of a house. "At Lota, 12 o'clock, Don Horatio is passing. Put on the rice." He turned toward the door, saying with lordly gravity, "I'm no wench's clock." He jerked out the abusive words without sacrificing any of his dignity. From that day he changed his route to disappoint those whom he perceived had come to depend on his punctuality. Sometimes he talked to his grandson about the ancient greatness of the house. Geographical discoveries had ruined the Febres. The Mediterranean was no longer the highway to the Orient. The Portuguese and Spanish of the other sea had discovered new routes and the Majorcan ships lay rotting in idleness. There were no longer battles with pirates. The Holy Order of Malta was now only an honorable distinction. A brother of his father, knight commander at Valletta when Bonaparte conquered the island, had come to spend his last days in Palma with only the meager pension of a half-pay officer. It had been 2 centuries since the Febres, forgotten on the sea where there was no longer any commerce, and where only poor padrones and fishermen's sons now made war, had given themselves up to investing their name with a splendorous luxury, which gradually ruined them. The grandfather had witnessed the times of genuine seigneury, when to be a Butifarra in Majorca was something which the people rated between God and caballeros. The arrival of a Febre in the world was an event which was discussed throughout the entire city. The great parturient dame remained secluded in the palace 40 days, and during all this time the doors were open, the zaguin filled with vehicles, the whole retinue of servants lined up in the antechamber, the salons filled with callers, the tables covered with sweets, cakes, and refreshments. Days of the week were set apart for the reception of each social class. Some were only for the Butifarras, the aristocracy of the aristocrats, privileged houses, renowned families, all united by the relationship of continual intermarriage. Other days for caballeros, traditional nobility who were looked down upon by the former without knowing why. Next the moçons were received, an inferior class, but in familiar contact with the grandees, the intellectual people of the epoch, doctors, lawyers, and scriveners, who loaned their services to illustrious families. Don Horatio recalled the splendor of these receptions. The people of the olden time knew how to do things in the grand way. "It was when your father was born," he said to his grandson, "that the last fiesta was held in this house. I paid a confectioner on the Paseo del Born 800 Majorcan pounds for sweets, cakes, and refreshments. Jamie actually remembered less about his father than about his grandfather. In his memory he was a sweet and sympathetic figure, but somewhat dim. When he thought of him he recalled only a soft, light beard like his own, a bald forehead, a happy smile, and eyeglasses which glittered as he bent over. It was said that when a boy he had a love affair with his cousin Juana, that austere senora whom everybody called the Popess, who lived like a nun, and who enjoyed enormous riches, making prodigal donations in former times to the pretender Don Carlos, and now to the ecclesiastics who surrounded her. The rupture between his father and Juana the Popess was, no doubt, the reason why she held herself aloof from this branch of the family and treated Jamie with hostile frigidity. His father had been an officer in the Navy, in accordance with family tradition. He was in the war on the Pacific coast of South America. He was a lieutenant on one of the frigates that bombarded Callao, and, as if he only desired to give a proof of his valor, he immediately retired from the service. Then he married a señorita of Palma, of meager fortune, whose father was military governor of the island of Iviza. The Popess Juana, talking with Jamie one day, had tried to wound him by saying in her cold voice and with her haughty mien, "Your mother was noble, of a family of caballeros, but she was not a Butifarra like ourselves." The early years of his life, when Jamie first began to take notice of the things about him, were passed without seeing his father save during hasty trips to Majorca. He was a progressive, and the Reform Party had made him a deputy. Later, when Amadis of Savoy was proclaimed king, this revolutionary monarch, execrated and deserted by the traditional nobility, had been compelled to turn to new historic names to form his court. The Butifarra, Febra, through a party demand, became a high palace functionary. When he insisted that his wife should remove to Madrid, she refused to abandon the island. She go to the court. How about his son? Don Horatio, steadily growing more slender and weak, but ever erect in his eternal new frock coat, continued taking his daily stroll, adjusting his life to the ticking of the clock of the Ayuntamiento. An old-time liberal, a great admirer of Martinez de la Rosa for his verses and the diplomatic elegance of his cravats, made a wry face when he read the newspapers and the letters from his son. What was all this leading to? During the short period of the Republic the father returned to the island, considering his career ended. The Popess Juana, despite the fact of their relationship, refused to recognize him. She was much occupied during that epoch. She made journeys to the peninsula. It was said that she turned over enormous sums to the partisans of Don Carlos who were carrying on the war in Catalonia and the northern provinces. Let no one mention Jamie Febra, the old-time naval officer, in her presence. She was a genuine Butifarra, a defender of their traditions, and she was making sacrifices in order that Spain might be governed by gentlemen. Her cousin was worse than a tutor, he was a shirtless beggar. According to the gossips, bitterness for certain deceptions in the past which she could not forget was mingled with this hatred of his political professions. On the restoration of the Bourbons, this progressive, he who had been a Palatine under Amadis, became a Republican and a conspirator. He made frequent journeys, he received cipher letters from Paris, he went to Minorca to visit the squadron anchored in Port Mahon, and taking advantage of his former official friendships, he catechized his companions, planning an uprising of the navy. He threw into these revolutionary enterprises the adventurous ardor of the Febras of old, the same cool daring, until he died suddenly in Barcelona, far from his kindred. The grandfather received the news with impassive gravity, but the neighbor women of Palma who awaited his passing along the streets to set their rice over the fire, saw him no more. 86. He had strolled enough. He had seen enough of this world. He retired to the second story, where he admitted no one but his grandson. When his relatives came to see him he preferred to go down to the reception hall, in spite of his debility, correctly attired, wearing his new frock coat, the two white triangles of his collar peeping above the folds of his stock, always freshly shaven, his side whiskers carefully combed and his toupee brilliant with pomatum. At last came a day when he could not leave his bed, and the grandson found him between the sheets, looking as usual, still wearing his fine batiste shirt, the stock which his servant changed for him every day, and the flowered silk waistcoat. When a call from his daughter-in-law was announced, Don Horatio made a gesture of annoyance. "Jamito, the frock coat. It is a lady, and she must be received with decency." This operation was repeated when the doctor came, or when the few callers he deigned to receive were admitted. He must maintain himself, under arms, until his last moment, as he had been seen all his life. One afternoon he called with a weak voice to his grandson who sat by a window reading a book of travel. The boy might retire. He wished to be alone. Jamie left the room, and so the grandfather was able to die in solitude, free from the torment of having to pay attention to the neatness of his appearance, with no witnesses to the grimaces and contortions of the last agony. Febra and his mother being left alone, the boy grew eager for independence. His imagination was filled with the adventures and voyages of which he had read in his grandfather's library, and he was inspired with the deeds of his forefathers immortalized in family history. He yearned to become a mariner or a warrior, like his father and like the majority of his ancestors. His mother opposed him with an agony of dread which turned her cheeks pale and her lips blue. The last Febra leading a life of danger far from her side. No, there had been heroes enough in the family. He must be a Senor on the island, a gentleman of tranquil life who would raise a family to perpetuate the name he bore. Jamie yielded to the prayers of his mother, that eternal invalid, in whom the slightest opposition seemed to precipitate the danger of death. Since she did not wish him to be a seafaring man, he must study for another career. He must live as did the other youths of his age with whom he mingled in the lecture halls of the Institute. At 16 he set sail for the peninsula. His mother wished that he should be a lawyer in order that he might disentangle the family fortune, burdened and oppressed with mortgages and other indebtedness. The luggage with which he started was enormous, enough to furnish a house, and likewise his pocket was well lined. A Febra must not live like any poor student. First he went to Valencia, his mother believing that city less dangerous for the young. For the next course of lectures he passed on to Barcelona, and thus several years were spent flitting from one university to another, according to the notions of the professors and their ready connivance with the students. He made no great progress in his career. He sneaked through certain courses by the cool audacity with which he talked of things of which he knew nothing, and passed examinations by some lucky chance. In others he flunked completely. His mother accepted his explanations in good faith on his return to Majorca. She consoled him, advising him not to exert himself too much over his studies, and she railed against the injustice of the times. Her implacable enemy, the pompous Juana, was right. These were no times for gentlemen, war had been declared against them, all manner of injustices were committed to keep them in the background. Jamie enjoyed a certain popularity in the clubs and cafes of Barcelona and Valencia where he gambled. They called him the Magican of the ounces, because his mother remitted his gold in gold ounces, which rolled with scandalous glitter across the green tables. Adding to the prestige given by this extravagance was his strange title of Butifarra, which caused a smile in the peninsula, yet at the same time it evoked in the imagination a picture of feudal authority, accompanied with the rights of a sovereign lord in those distant islands. 5 years passed. Jamie was now a man, but he had not yet compassed the half of his studies. His fellow students from the island, when they came home in summer, entertained their cronies in the cafes on the Paseo del Born with stories of Febra's adventures in Barcelona, how he was frequently seen on the streets with luxurious women clinging to his arm, how the rude people who frequented the gambling houses showed respect for the Magican of the ounces, on account of his strength and courage. They told how, one night, he had laid hands on a certain bully, lifting him off his feet in his athletic arms, and hurling him out of the window. The peaceful Magicans, on hearing this, smiled with local pride. He was a Febra, a genuine Febra. The island still produced valiant youths as of old. Good Dona Purification, Jamie's mother, experienced grave displeasure and at the same time maternal joy on hearing that a certain scandalous woman had followed her son to the island. She understood it, and she forgave her. A youth as attractive as her Jamie. But with her dresses and her habits the young woman disturbed the tranquil customs of the city, the staid. Families became indignant, and Dona Purification, making use of intermediaries, came to an understanding with her, giving her money on the condition that she should leave the island. At other vacation times the scandal was even greater. Jamie, who had gone to San Febra on a hunting trip, had an affair with a pretty peasant girl and was on the point of shooting a rustic swain who pretended to her hand. His rural love adventures helped him to pass his summer exile. He was a true Febra, like his grandfather. The poor lady had known how to deal with that ever-grave and dignified father-in-law who nevertheless chucked young peasant girls under the chin without losing his sedate and lordly frigidity. In the vicinity of the estate of San Febra were many youths who bore the features of Don Horatio, but his wife, the Mexican lady, poetic soul, lived above such vulgarities, while, with her harp between her knees and her eyes dilated, she recited Ossian's poems. The rustic beauties with their snowy rebosolos, their hanging braids, and white hempen sandals, attracted the immaculate and lordly Febras with an irresistible force. When Dona Purification complained of the long hunting excursions which her son took throughout the island, he would stay in the city and spend the day in the garden, practicing shooting with a pistol. He called his mother's attention to a sack lying in the shade of an orange tree. "Do you see that? It is a quintal of powder. I shall not stop until I have used it all up." Mammy Antonia was afraid to peep out of her kitchen windows, and the nuns who occupied a portion of the ancient palace showed their white hoods for an instant, and then hid themselves immediately like doves frightened by the continual popping. The garden with its battlemented enclosure, contiguous to the sea wall, rang from morning till night with the sound of the detonations. The astonished birds flew away, green lizards crept over the cracked walls hiding in the shelter of the ivy, cats leaped along the paths in terror. The trees were very old, venerable as the palace itself, centenarian oranges with twisted trunks, leaning on the support of a circle of forked sticks to hold up their ancient limbs, gigantic magnolias with more wood than leaves. Unfruitful palms lifting themselves into blue space, seeking the sea which they greeted above the melons with the fluttering plumes of their crested heads. The sun made the bark of the trees creak, and forgotten seeds on the ground burst forth. Insects buzzing across the bars of light which shot through the foliage danced like golden sparks. Ripe figs loosened from the branches fell with soft patter. In the distance rose the murmur of the sea lashing the rocks at the foot of the wall. This calm was broken only by Febra, who continued firing his pistol. He had become a master shot. When he aimed at the figure sketched on the wall he lamented that it was not a man, some hated enemy whom he must needs exterminate. Bang! That ball pierced his heart. He smiled with satisfaction at seeing the bullet hole outlined on the very spot at which he had aimed. The noise of the shooting, the smoke of the powder, aroused in his imagination warlike fancies, stories of struggle and death in which he was always the victorious hero. 20 years old and yet he had never fought a duel. He must have a fight with someone to prove his courage. It was a disgrace that he had no enemies, but he would try to make some when he returned to the peninsula. Continuing these vagaries of his imagination, excited by the cracking detonations, he pretended an affair of honor. His adversary wounded him with the first shot and he fell. He still had his pistol in his hand, he must defend himself while stretched on the ground, and to the great scandal of his mother and of Mammy Antonia, who thought him crazy as they peeped out of the window, he continued lying face downward shooting in this position, preparing for the time when he should be wounded. When he returned to the peninsula to continue his interminable studies, he went refreshed by the country life, sure of himself after his practice in the garden and eager to have the longed-for duel with the first man who should give him the slightest pretext. But as he was a courteous person, incapable of unjust provocation, with manners that inspired respect from the insolent, time passed and the duel did not take place. His exuberant vitality, his impulsive strength, were consumed in dark adventures, of which his fellow students afterward told on the island with admiration. While in Barcelona he received a telegram announcing that his mother was seriously ill. He was delayed 2 days before sailing, there was no boat ready. When he reached the island his mother was dead. Of the ancient family which he had seen in his childhood none remained. Only Mammy Antonia could recall the past. Jamie was 23 when he found himself master of the Febra fortune and in absolute liberty. The fortune had been diminished by the ostentation of his ancestors and burdened with encumbrances. The Febra house was big. It was like vessels which when wrecked and lost forever enriched the coast where they had dashed to pieces. The remains and spoils, upon which his ancestors would have looked with scorn, still represented a fortune. Jamie did not wish to think. He did not wish to know. He must live, he must see the world. So he gave up his studies. What need had he for law, and for Roman customs, and for ecclesiastical canons, in order to lead a gay existence? He knew enough. In reality, the most delightful of his accomplishments he owed to his mother. When he was a child still living in the palace, before he had ever seen a schoolmaster, she had taught him something of French and had given him a little instruction on an ancient piano with yellow keys and a great red silk reredos almost touching the ceiling. Others knew less than he, and yet they were just as gentlemanly and they were much happier. Now for life. He stayed 2 years in Madrid, where he affected mistresses who gave him a certain notoriety and drove famous horses. He became the intimate friend of a celebrated bullfighter, and he gambled heavily in the clubs on Alcala Street. He fought a duel, but with swords, instead of lying on the ground, pistol in hand, as he had formerly pictured to himself, and he came out of the affair with a scratch on his arm, something in the nature of a pinprick in the epidermis of an elephant. He was no longer the Magican with the ounces. The hoard of round gold pieces treasured by his mother had vanished. He now flung bank bills prodigally upon the gaming tables, and when bad luck assailed him he wrote to his administrator, a lawyer, the scion of a family of old-time Mossons, retainers of the Febres during many centuries. Jamie wearied of Madrid, where he felt himself essentially a stranger. The soul of the ancient Febres lingered within him, those travelers through all countries except Spain, for they had ever lived with their backs turned upon their sovereigns. Many of his ancestors were familiar with every one of the important Mediterranean cities, they had visited the princes of the small Italian states, they had been received in audience by the Pope and by the Grand Turk, but never had it occurred to them to visit Madrid. Moreover, Febre was often irritated with his relatives in the court city, youths proud of their noble titles who smiled at his odd appellation of Butifarra. With what indifference his family had allowed various marquisates to descend to relatives on the peninsula while they clung to their supreme title of island nobility in the high knightly rank of Malta. He began to run over Europe, fixing his residence in the autumn and during part of the winter in Paris, spending the cold months on the Blue Coast, spring in London, summer in Ostend, with various trips to Italy, Egypt, and Norway to see the midnight sun. In this new existence he was barely known. He was one traveler more, an insignificant circulating globule in the great arterial network which desire for travel extends over the continent, but this life of continual movement, of tedious monotony, and unexpected adventures, satisfied his hereditary instinct, the inclinations transmitted from his remote ancestors, constant visitors among new peoples. This wandering existence, also, satiated his longing for the extraordinary. In the hotels at Nice, phalansteries of the most polite and hypocritical worldly corruption, he had been flattered in the seclusion of his room by unexpected visits. In Egypt he had been compelled to flee from the caresses of a decadent Hungarian countess, a withered flower of elegance, with moist eyes and violent perfume. He passed his 28th birthday in Munich. A short time before he had gone to Bayreuth to hear the Wagnerian operas, and now in the capital of Bavaria he attended the theatre of the residence, where the Mozart festival was celebrated. Jamie was not a melomaniac, but his vagrant existence forced him with the crowd, and his accomplishment as an amateur pianist had led him to make his musical pilgrimage for 2 consecutive years. In the hotel in Munich he met Miss Mary Gordon, whom he had seen before at the Wagner Theatre. She was an English girl, tall, slender, with firm flesh and the body of a gymnast which exercise had developed into agreeable feminine curves, giving her a youthful figure, and the wholesome, asexual appearance of a handsome boy. Her beautiful head was that of a court page, with skin as transparent as porcelain, pink nostrils like those of a toy dog, deep blue eyes and blonde hair, pale gold on the surface and dark gold beneath. Her beauty was adorable but fragile, that British beauty which is lost at 30 beneath purplish flushes and blotches on the skin. In the restaurant Jamie had several times surprised the gaze of her blue eyes, frankly, tranquilly bold, fixed upon him. She was attended by a fat, spongy woman with rouged cheeks, a traveling companion dressed in black with a red straw hat and a broad belt of the same color, which divided the bulky hemispheres of her breast and abdomen. Young and graceful, Mary Gordon resembled a flower of golden nacre in her white flannel suits of masculine cut with a mannish cravat, and a panama with drooping brim around which she wound a blue veil. Febre met the pair at every turn, in the picture gallery, standing before Dürer's Evangelists, in the hall of sculpture examining Aegina's marbles, in the Rococo theatre of the residence, where Mozart was sung, an audience hall of a former century, with decorations of porcelain and garlands which seemed to require that the spectators wear the purple heel and the white wig. Accustomed to meeting each other, Jamie greeted her with a smile and she seemed to answer timidly with the flash of her eyes. One morning, on coming out of his room, he met the English girl on a landing of the stairway. She was bending her boyish breast over the balustrade. "Lift, lift," she called with her bird-like voice, summoning the elevator man to bring it up. Febre bowed as he entered the movable cage with her, and said a few words in French to start a conversation. The English girl stared at him in silence with her light blue eyes in which a star of gold seemed to be floating. She remained silent as if she did not understand, yet Jamie had seen her in the reading room turning the leaves of the Parisian dailies. Stepping out of the elevator she turned with hasty step toward the office where sat the hotel clerk, pen in hand. He listened with obsequious mien, like a polyglot quick to understand each of his guests, and coming out from his enclosure he made straight toward Jamie, who, still embarrassed by his unsuccessful venture, was pretending to read the advertisements in the vestibule. Febre at first did not realize that it was he who was being addressed. "Senor, this lady asks me to introduce you to her," said the clerk. Turning toward the English girl he added with Teutonic composure, like one fulfilling a duty, Monsieur the Hidalgo Febra, Marquis of Spain. He understood the part he was playing. Everyone who travels with good valises is an Hidalgo and a Marquis until the contrary be proven. Then, with his eyes, he indicated the English girl who stood stiff and grave during the ceremony without which no well-bred woman may exchange a word with a man, Miss Gordon, Doctor of the University of Melbourne. The young lady extended her white-gloved hand and shook Febra's with gymnastic vigor. Not till then did she venture to speak. "Oh, Spain! Oh, Don Quixote!" Unconsciously they strolled out of the hotel together discussing the afternoon performances which they had attended. There was to be no function at the theaters that day and she was thinking of going to the park called Theresienwiese, at the foot of the Statue of Bavaria, to see the Tyrolese fair and to listen to the folk songs. After breakfasting at the hotel they went to the fairgrounds. They climbed upon an enormous statue and viewed the Bavarian plain, its lakes and its distant mountains. They explored the memorial hall, filled with busts of celebrated Bavarians, most of whose names they read for the first time, and they finished by going from booth to booth, admiring the costumes of the Tyrolese, their gymnastic dances, their bird-like warbling and trilling. They went about as if they had known each other all their lives, Jamie admiring the masculine liberty of Saxon girls who are not afraid of associating with men and who feel strong in their ability to take care of themselves. From that day they visited together museums, academies, old churches, sometimes alone, and again with a companion, who made strenuous exertions to keep pace with them. They were comrades who communicated their impressions without thinking of difference of sex. Jamie was disposed to take advantage of this intimacy by making gallant speeches, by risking little advances, but he restrained himself. With women like this action might be dangerous, they remain impassive, proof against all manner of impressions. He must wait until she should take the initiative. These were women who could go alone around the world, likely to interrupt passionate advances with the blows of a trained boxer. He had seen some in his travels who carried diminutive nickel-plated revolvers in their muffs or in their handbags along with powder box and handkerchief. Mary Gordon told of the distant oceanic archipelago in which her father exercised authority like a viceroy. She had no mother, and she had come to Europe to complete studies begun in Australia. She held the degree a doctor from the University of Melbourne, a doctor of music. Jamie, suppressing his astonishment at this news from a distant world, told of himself, of his family, of his native land, of the curiosities of the island, of the cavern of Arta, tragically grand, chaotic as an antechamber of the Inferno, of the dragon's caves with their forests of stalactites, glistening like an ice palace, of its 1,000 placid lakes, from the deep crystal depths of which it seemed as if nude sirens would arise like those Rhine maidens who guarded the treasure of the Nibelungs. Mary listened to him, entranced. Jamie seemed to grow greater before her eyes, as she learned that he was a son of that Isle of Dreams, where the sea is always blue, where the sun is ever shining, and where blooms the orange flower. Febra began to spend his afternoons in the room of the English girl. The performances of the Mozart Festival were ended. Miss Gordon needed daily the spiritual uplift of music. She had a piano in her reception room, and a roll of opera scores which accompanied her on her travels. Jamie sat near, before the keyboard, trying to accompany the pieces she was interpreting, ever those of the same author, the God, the Only. The hotel was near the station, and the noise of drays, carriages and street cars annoyed the English woman and she closed the windows. Her stout companion had gone to her own apartment, rejoiced at being free from that musical tempest, the delights of which could not compare with those of making a good bit of Irish point lace. Miss Gordon, alone with the Spaniard, treated him as if she were a master. "Come, do that again, let us repeat the theme of the sword. Pay attention." But Jamie was distracted, peeping out of the corner of his eye at the girl's long, white neck bristling with little golden locks, at the network of blue veins delicately outlined beneath the transparency of her pearly skin. One afternoon it rained, the leaden sky seemed to graze the roofs of the houses, in the reception room there was the diffused light of a cellar. They were playing almost in the dark, bending their heads forward to read the score. Forth rolled the music of the Forest of Enchantments, moving its green and whispering tree-tops before the rude Siegfried, the innocent child of nature, eager to know the language of the soul and of inanimate things. The master bird sang, his voice rising above the murmur of the foliage. Mary was trembling with excitement. "Ah, poet, poet!" She continued playing. Then, in the growing darkness of the room, sounded the strong chords which accompanied the hero to the tomb, the funeral march of the warriors bearing upon the shield the muscular body of Siegfried, with his golden hair, interrupting the melancholy phrase of the God of Gods. Mary continued trembling, until suddenly her hands fell from the keyboard and her head rested on Jamie's shoulder, like a bird folding its wings. "Oh, Richard."
Richard, mon bien-aimé.
The Spaniard saw her wandering eyes and her tremulous lips offering themselves to him. In his grasp he felt her cold hands, her breath floated about him. Against his bosom were pressed hidden curves of firm elastic plumpness, the existence of which he had not suspected. There was no more music that afternoon. At midnight when Febre retired, he had not yet recovered from his astonishment. After so many fears, this was the way things had happened, with the greatest simplicity, as one is offered a hand, without exertion on his part. Another surprise had been to hear himself called by a name which was not his. Who could that Richard be? But in the hour of sweet and dreamy explanations which follow those of madness and forgetfulness, she had told him of the impression she had received in Bayreuth when she saw him for the first time among the thousand heads which filled the theatre. It was he, the great musician, as he was portrayed in his youthful pictures. When she met him again in Munich beneath the same roof, she had felt that the die was cast and that it was useless to resist this attraction. Febre examined himself with ironical curiosity in the mirror in his room. What ideas a woman is capable of conceiving. Yes, he was something like that other one, the heavy forehead, the drooping hair, the beaked nose, and the prominent chin, which, in years to come would turn inward, seeking each other, and give him a certain witch-like profile. Excellent and glorious Richard! By what miracle had Wagner brought to him one of the greatest joys of his existence? What an original woman was this! Astonishment, mingled with a shade of annoyance, grew upon Febre as the days passed. She seemed to forget what had taken place, and to grow constantly more unapproachable. She received him with grave rigidity, as if nothing had occurred, as if the past had left no trace upon her mind, as if the day before had never been. Only when music evoked the memory of the other man came tenderness and submission. Jamie was irritated, and he determined to dominate her. He would prove himself a man. At last he triumphed to such an extent that the piano was heard less and she began to see in him something more than a living picture of her idol. In their happy intoxication Munich and the hotel in which they had seen each other as strangers seemed to them offensive. They felt the need of flying far away, where they could make love freely, and one day they found themselves in a port which had a stone lion at its entrance, while beyond spread the liquid surface of an immense lake which mingled with the sky on the horizon. They were in Lindau. One steamer could convey them to Switzerland, another to Constance, but they preferred the tranquil German city of the famous Ecumenical Council, establishing themselves in the Island Hotel, an ancient Dominican monastery. Febre was stirred as he contemplated this epoch, the happiest of his existence. Mary continued for him ever an original woman, in whom there was always something left to conquer, tolerant at certain hours, repellent and austere throughout the rest of the day. He was her lover, and yet she would not permit the slightest familiarity, nor any liberty which might reveal the confidence of their common life. The least allusion to their intimacy caused her to flush in protest. Shocking! Yet, every morning at daybreak Febre sneaked into his room along the corridors of the old convent, unmade his bed so that the servants would not suspect, and he would show himself on the balcony. The birds were singing in the tall rose bushes in the garden below his feet. Beyond, the immense sheet of Lake Constance was flushing with purple tints caught from the rising sun. The first fishing barks were cleaving the orange-tinted waters, in the distance sounded the cathedral bells, softened by the damp, morning breeze. The cranes began to creak on the quay where the waters ceased to be a lake, and narrowing into a channel become the river Rhine. The footsteps of the servants and the swish of cleaning startled the monastic cloister with the noises of the hotel. Near the balcony, adjoining the wall, and so close that Jamie could touch it with his hand, was a small tower with a slate roof and with ancient coats of arms on the circular wall. It was the tower in which John Huss had been imprisoned before going to the stake. The Spaniard thought of Mary. At this time she must be in the perfumed shadows of her room, her blonde head clasped in her arms, sleeping her first real sleep of the night, her tired body still vibrant from fatigue. Poor John Huss! Febre sympathized with him as if he had been his friend. To burn him in the presence of such a beautiful landscape, perhaps on a morning like this. To cast one's self into the wolf's mouth, and to give up one's life over the question whether the Pope were good or bad, or whether laymen should receive the sacrament with wine the same as priests. To die for such absurdities when life is so beautiful and the heretic might have enjoyed it so richly with any of the plump-breasted, big-hipped blonde women, friends of the cardinals, who witnessed his torture. Unhappy apostle! Jamie ironically pitied the simplicity of the martyr. He looked at life through different eyes. Viva el ama. Love was the only thing worthwhile in life. They remained nearly a month in the ancient episcopal city, strolling out in the gloaming through the lonely, grass-grown streets with their crumbling palaces of the time of the council, floating with the current down the river Rhine along its forest-clad banks, stopping to look at the tiny houses with red roofs and spacious arbors beneath which sang the bourgeoisie, stein in hand, with the Germanic joy of a subchanter, grave and reposeful. From Constance they passed on to Switzerland and afterward to Italy. They traveled together for a year viewing landscapes, seeing museums, visiting ruins, the windings and sheltered nooks in which Jamie made use of for kissing Mary's pearly skin, reveling in the rush of color and the gesture of annoyance with which she protested, shocking. The old traveling companion, unconscious as a suitcase of the points of interest in their journey, continued making the cloak of Irish Point, beginning in Germany, and working at it while crossing the Alps, along the whole length of the Apennines and in sight of Vesuvius and Etna. Unable to talk with Febra, who spoke no English, she greeted him with the yellowish glitter of her teeth and returned to her task, forming a conspicuous figure in the hotel lobbies. The two lovers spoke of marriage. Mary summed up the situation with energetic decision. She need only write a few lines to her father. He was very far away, and besides she never consulted him in regard to her affairs. He would approve whatever she did, sure of her wisdom and prudence. They were in Sicily, a land which reminded Febra of his own island. The ancient members of his family had been here also, but with cuirasses on their breasts, and in worse company. Mary spoke of the future, arranging the financial side of the anticipated partnership with the practical sense of her race. It did not matter to her that Febra had little fortune, she was rich enough for both, and she enumerated her worldly goods, lands, houses, and stocks like an administrator with accurate memory. On their return to Rome they would be married in the evangelical chapel and also in a Catholic church. She knew a cardinal who had arranged for her an audience with the Pope. His Eminence would manage everything. Jamie passed a sleepless night in a hotel in Syracuse. Marriage. Mary was agreeable, she made life pleasant, and she would bring with her a fortune. But should he really marry her? Then the other man began to annoy him, the illustrious shade which had appeared in Zurich, in Venice, in every place visited by them which held memories of the maestro's past. Jamie would grow old, and music, his formidable rival, would be ever fresh. In a little while, when marriage should have robbed his relations of the charm of illegality, of the delight of the prohibited, Mary would discover some orchestra leader who bore a still greater resemblance to the other man, or some ugly violinist with long hair and possessed of youth who would remind her of Beethoven in his boyhood. Besides, he was a different race, different customs and passions. He was tired of her shamefaced reserve in love, of her resistance to final submission which had pleased him at first, but which had come at last to bore him. No, there was yet time to save himself. I regret it on account of what she will think of Spain. I regret it on account of Don Quixote, he said to himself while packing his suitcase one morning at sunrise. He fled, losing himself in Paris, where the English woman would never seek him. She hated that ungrateful city for its hissing of Tannhauser many years before she was born. Of these relations, which had lasted a year, Jamie cherished only the memory of a felicity, increased and sweetened by the passing of time and by a lock of golden hair. Then, too, he must have somewhere among his papers, guide-books, and postcards, lying forgotten in an old secretary in the great house, a photograph of the feminine doctor of music, strangely adorable in her long-sleeved toga with a square plate-like cap from which hung a tassel. Of the rest of his life he remembered little, a void of tedium broken only by monetary worries. The administrator was slow and grudging in sending his remittances. Jamie would ask him for money and he would reply with grumbling letters, telling of interest which must be met, of second mortgages on which he could barely realize a loan, of the precariousness of a fortune in which nothing was left free of encumbrance. Febra, believing that his presence might disentangle this wretched situation, made short trips to Majorca, which always resulted in the sale of property, yielding him scarcely enough money to take flight again, heedless of his administrator's advice. Money aroused in him a smiling optimism. Everything would turn out all right. As a last resort he counted on recourse to matrimony. Meanwhile, he would live. He managed to exist a few years longer, sometimes in Madrid, or again in the great foreign cities, until at last his administrator brought this period of merry prodigality to an end by sending his resignation, with his accounts and his refusal to continue forwarding money. He had spent 1 year on the island, buried, as he said, with no other diversion than nights of gambling in the casino and afternoons on the Paseo del Born, sitting around a table with a company of friends, sedentary islanders who reveled in the stories of his travels. Misery and want, this was the reality of his present life. His creditors threatened him with immediate legal process. He still outwardly retained possession of son Febra and of other estates derived from his forefathers, but property yielded little on the island. The rents, according to traditional custom, were no higher than in the time of his ancestors, for the families of the original renters inherited the right to farm the lands. They made payments directly to his creditors, but even this did not satisfy half of the interest due. The palace was but a storehouse for its rich decorations. The noble mansion of the Febras was submerged, and no one could float it. Sometimes Jamie calmly considered the convenience of slipping out of his wretched predicament with neither humiliation nor dishonor by letting himself be found some afternoon in the garden asleep forever under an orange tree with a revolver in his hand. One day in this frame of mind, a crony gave him an idea as he was leaving the casino in the small hours of the night, one of those moments in which nervous insomnia causes a person to see things in an extraordinary light in which they stand out clearly. Don Benito Valls, the rich Jew, was very fond of him. Several times he had intervened, unsought, in his affairs, saving him from immediate ruin. It was due to personal liking for Febra and to respect for his name. Valls had a single heiress, and, moreover, he was an invalid. The prolific exuberance characteristic of his race had not been fulfilled in him. His daughter Catalina, when she was younger, had wished to be a nun, but, now that she was past 20, she felt a strong desire for the pomps and vanities of this world, and she expressed tender sympathy for Febra whenever his misfortunes were discussed in her hearing. Jamie recoiled from the proposition with almost as much astonishment as Mammy Antonia. A tutor. The idea, however, began to fasten itself upon his mind, lubricated in its incessant hammering by the ever-increasing poverty and necessity which grew with the passing days. Why not? Valls' daughter was the richest heiress on the island, and money possessed neither blood nor race. At last he had yielded to the urging of his friends, officious mediators between himself and the family of the girl, and that morning he was on his way to breakfast at the house in Valdemosa where Valls resided the greater part of the year for relief from the asthma which was choking him. Jamie made an effort to remember Catalina. He had seen her several times on the streets of Palma, a good figure, a pleasant face. When she should live far from her kindred and should dress better, she would be quite presentable. But, could he love her? Febra smiled skeptically. Was love indispensable to marriage? Matrimony was a trip in double harness for the rest of life, and one only needed to seek in the woman those qualities demanded of a traveling companion: good disposition, identical tastes, the same likes and dislikes in eating and drinking. Love. Everyone believed he had a right to it, while love was like talent, like beauty, like fortune, a special gift which only rare and privileged persons might enjoy. By good luck, deception came to conceal this cruel inequality, and all human beings ended their days, thinking of their youth with melancholy longing, believing they had really known love, when they had in reality experienced nothing but a youthful delirium. Love was a beautiful thing, but not indispensable to matrimony nor to existence. The important thing was to choose a good companion for the rest of the journey, to set the pace of the two to the same tune, so that there should be no kicking over the traces nor collisions, to dominate the nerves so that there should be no jar during the continual contact of the common existence, to be able to lie down together like good comrades, with mutual respect, without wounding each other with the knees nor jabbing each other in the ribs with the elbows. He expected to find all these things and to consider himself well content. Suddenly Valdemosa appeared before his eyes above the crest of a hill, surrounded by mountains. The tower of La Cartuja, with its decorations of green tiles, rose above the foliage of the gardens and the cells. Febra saw a carriage standing in a turn of the road. A man alighted from it, waving his arms so that Jamie's driver would stop his horses. Then he opened the carriage door and climbed in, smiling, taking a seat beside Febra. "Hello, Captain," exclaimed Jamie in astonishment. "You didn't expect me, eh? I'm going to the breakfast, too. I have invited myself. What a surprise it will be for my brother." Jamie pressed his hand. It was one of his most loyal friends, Captain Pablo Valls. Chapter 3. Jew and Gentile. Pablo Valls was known throughout all Palma. When he seated himself on the terrace of a café on the Paseo del Born, a compact circle of listeners would form around him, smiling at his forceful gestures and at his loud voice, which was ever incapable of discreet tones. "I am a Chueta, and what of that? A Jew of the Jews. All of my family come from the street. When I was in command of the Roger de Lauria, being one day in Algiers, I stopped before the door of the synagogue, and an old man, after looking me over, said, "You may enter, you are one of us." I gave him my hand and answered, "Thanks, fellow believer." His hearers laughed, and Captain Valls, proclaiming in a loud voice his Chewatan ancestry, glanced in every direction, as if defying the houses, the people, and the soul of the island, hostile to his race through the fanatical hatred of centuries. His physiognomy revealed his origin. His grey-tinged ruddy side whiskers denoted the retired seafaring man, but between these shaggy adornments projected his Semitic profile, the heavy, aquiline nose, the prominent chin, the eyes with elongated lids, and pupil of amber and gold according to the play of light, and in which here and there floated tobacco-colored spots. He had been much on the sea, he had lived for long periods in England and in the United States, and as a result of his contact with those lands of liberty, free from religious tolerance, he had brought back a belligerent frankness which impelled him to defy the traditional prejudices of the island, socially and politically, unprogressive and stagnant. The other Chewatas, cowed by centuries of persecution and scorn, concealed their origin, or tried to make it forgotten through their humble demeanor. Captain Valls took advantage of every occasion to discuss the matter, parading the name of Chewata as a title of nobility, as a challenge which he hurled at the popular bias. "I am a Jew, and what of that?" he shouted again, "a co-religionist of Jesus, of St. Paul, of the other saints who are venerated on the altars. The Butifarras boast of their ancestors, but they date scarcely further back than yesterday. I am more noble, more ancient. My forefathers were the patriarchs of the Bible." Then, waxing indignant over the antipathy to his race, he again became aggressive. "In all Spain," he announced gravely, "there is not a Christian who can lift a finger. We are all descendants of Jews or of Moors. And he who is not. Here he stopped, and after a brief pause affirmed resolutely, he who is not, is the descendant of a priest. On the peninsula the traditional odium for the Jew which still separates the population of Majorca into two antagonistic races does not exist. Pablo Valls became furious discussing his fatherland. Openly Orthodox Jews did not exist there. The last synagogue had been dissolved centuries ago. The Jews had all been converted en masse, and the recalcitrant were burned by the Inquisition. The Chewatas of the present day were the most fervent Catholics of Majorca, bringing to their profession of faith a Semitic zealotry. They prayed aloud, they made priests of their sons, they sought influence to place their daughters in the convents, they figured as moneyed people among the partisans of the most conservative ideas, and yet, against them lay the same antipathy as in former centuries, and they lived ostracized, with no allies in any social class. For 450 years we have had the water of baptism on our pates, Captain Valls continued in loud tones, and yet we are still the accursed, the reprobates, as before the conversion. Isn't that queer? The Chewatas. Look out for them. Bad people. In Majorca there are two Catholicisms, one for our people, and another for the rest. Then with the concentrated odium gathered from centuries of persecution, the sailor said, referring to his racial brethren, they are doing their best through cowardice, through too great love for the island, for this little rock, this Roqueta on which we were born, to not forsake it. They became Christians, and now, when they are really Christians at heart they are paid for it with kicks. Had they continued to be Jews, dispersing throughout the world as others have done, perhaps at this moment they would be great personages, bankers to kings, instead of sticking in their little shops on the street, making silver handbags. Himself a skeptic, he scorned or attacked them all, the Jews faithful to their old beliefs, the converts, the Catholics, the Musulmans, with whom he had lived on his journeys to the coasts of Africa and in the ports of Asia Minor. Again he would be dominated by an atavistic tenderness, displaying a certain religious respect toward his race. He was a Semite, he declared it with pride, beating his chest, the greatest people in the world. We were a lousy, starving crowd when we were in Asia, because there was no one in that land with whom to traffic, nor to whom we could loan our money. But no race has given the human flock more actual shepherds than has ours, which shall yet be for centuries and centuries masters of men. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad are from my country. 3 strong champions, caballeros. And now we have given the world a 4th prophet, also of our race and of our blood, only that this one has 2 faces and 2 names. On the obverse he is called Rothschild, and is the captain of all who lay up money. On the reverse he is Karl Marx, the apostle of those who wish to wrest it from the rich. The history of the race on the island Valls condensed after his fashion into brief words. The Jews were many, very many in former times. Nearly all the commerce was in their hands, most of the ships were theirs. The Febres, and other Christian potentates, had no objection to being their associates. The ancient times might be called the times of liberty. Persecution and cruelty were relatively modern. Jews were the treasurers of kings, doctors, the courtiers of the courts of the peninsula. When religious feuds broke out, the richest and most astute Hebrews of the island were wise enough to become converted in time, voluntarily, mixing with the native families and sinking their origin into oblivion. These new Catholics were the very ones who, later on, with the fervor of the neophyte, had instigated the persecution against their former brethren. The Chuetas of the present time, the only Magickans of recognized Jewish origin, were the descendants of the last to be converted, the offspring of the families persecuted by the Inquisition. To be a Chueta, to spring from the street of the silversmiths, which by antonomasia is called the street, is the greatest disgrace which can happen to a Magican. In vain had revolutions been made in Spain, in vain had liberal laws been passed which recognized the equality of all Spaniards. The Chueta when he passed on to the peninsula was a citizen like other people, but in Majorca he was a reprobate, a kind of pest who could marry none but his own kindred. Valls commented ironically upon the social order, resembling the steps of a stairway, in which the different classes of the island had dwelt for centuries and where many steps still remained intact. Aloft, on the vortex, the proud Butifarras, then the nobles, the caballeros, afterward the moçons, trailing along behind these came the merchants, the artisans, and finally the cultivators of the soil. Here opened an enormous gap in the order established by God in creating the classes, a vast open space which each one could people according to his caprice. Undoubtedly after the Magican nobles and plebeians came hogs, dogs, asses, cats, rats, and, at the tail of all these beasts are the Lord, the despised citizen of the street, the Chueta, the pariah of the island. It mattered nothing if he were rich, like the brother of Captain Valls, or intellectual, like others. Many Chuetas who attained the dignity of state functionaries, army officers, magistrates, landed proprietors on the peninsula, found on returning to Majorca that the meanest beggar considered himself superior to them, and on the slightest excuse poured insults upon their persons and their families. The isolation of this bit of Spain, surrounded by the sea, served to keep intact the spirit of earlier epochs. In vain the Chuetas, fleeing from this odium which flourished despite the new era of progress, exaggerated their devotion to Catholicism with a blind and vehement faith, largely influenced by the fear absorbed into their souls and into their flesh during centuries of persecution. In vain they continued in imitation of their forefathers to recite their prayers in loud voices in their houses so that passers-by might hear, and they cooked their food in their windows so that all should see that they ate pork. The traditional barriers could not be overcome. The Catholic Church, which entitles itself universal, was cruel and harsh with the Jews on the island, repaying their adherents with disdainful repulsion. The sons of the Chuetas who desired to become priests found no room in the seminary. The convents closed their doors against every novice proceeding from the street. On the peninsula the daughters of Chuetas married men of distinction and men of great fortune, but on the island they scarcely ever found one who would accept their hand and their riches. Bad people, continued Valls sarcastically. They are industrious, they lay up money, they live at peace in the bosoms of their families, they are more fervent Catholics even than the rest, but they are Chuetas. There must be something the matter with them to be so despised. Something there must be about them, do you understand? Something. He who wishes to know more let him find out for himself. The seaman laughingly told of the poor peasants from the country who until a few years ago declared in good faith that the Chuetas were covered with grease and had tails, taking advantage of an occasion when they found a lonely child from the street to disrobe him and convince themselves whether the story of the caudal appendage were true. And how about what happened to my brother? Continued Valls. To my sainted brother Benito, who prays aloud, and who is so devout that one might think he were going to actually devour the images. They all remembered the case of Don Benito Valls, and they laughed heartily, since his brother was ever the first to jest about the matter. The rich Chueta had found himself owner, on settling some accounts, of a house and valuable lands in a town in the interior of the island. On taking possession of the new property the most prudent citizens had given him good advice. He would be allowed to visit his property during the day, but as for spending the night in the house, never. There was no record of a Chueta having slept in the pueblo. Don Benito paid no attention to this counsel and he spent a night on his property, but scarcely had he gotten into bed than the domestics fled. When the master of the house had slept long enough he sprang from his couch. Not even the faintest ray of light entered through the crevice. He thought he must have slept at least 12 hours, yet it was still dark. He opened a window and his head bumped cruelly. He tried to open the door, but he could not. While he had been asleep, the neighbors had walled up all the windows and doors, and the tutor had to make his escape by way of the roof, to the accompaniment of shouts of laughter from the people who thus rejoiced over their work. This joke was merely by way of warning. If he persisted in going counter to the customs of the town, some night he would awake to find the house in flames. Very amusing, but very barbarous, added the captain. My brother, a good soul, a saint. They all laughed at this. He maintained friendly relations with his brother, although with some frigidity, and he made no secret of the grievances he had against him. Captain Varles was the bohemian of the family, ever on the high seas or in distant lands, leading the life of a gay bachelor. He had enough money on which to live. On the death of his father, his brother had taken charge of the business of the house, defrauding him of many thousands of dollars. The same as the Christians of olden times. Pablo hastened to add, in matters of inheritance there is neither race nor creed. Money recognizes no religion. The interminable persecutions suffered by his ancestors infuriated Varles. Advantage was taken of every circumstance for trampling underfoot the people of the street. When the peasants had grievances against the nobles, or when foreigners descended in armed bands upon the citizens of Palma, the difficulty was always settled by a joint attack upon the ward of the Tuiters, killing those who did not flee, and looting their shops. If a Majican battalion received orders to march to Spain in case of war, the soldiers mutinied, broke out of their barracks and sacked the street. When the reaction followed the revolutions in Spain, the royalists, to celebrate their triumph, assaulted the silversmiths' shops of the Tuiters, took possession of their riches, and made bonfires of their furniture, hurling even their crucifixes into the flames. Crucifixes belonging to old Jews, that, of course, must be false. And who are the people of the street? Shouted the captain. Everybody knows, those who have noses and eyes like mine, and there are many who are flat-nosed and present nothing of the common type. On the other hand, how many are there who pretend to be caballeros of antiquity, of proud nobility, with faces like Abraham and Jacob? There existed a list of suspicious surnames for identifying the genuine Tuiters, but these same surnames were borne by longtime Christians, and it was additional caprice which separated one from the other. Only the descendants of those families beaten or burned by the Inquisition had remained permanently marked by popular odium. The famous catalogue of surnames was made up undoubtedly from the autos of the holy officers. A joy indeed to become a Christian. The ancestors frizzled in the bonfire, and the descendants singled out and cursed for centuries upon centuries. The captain dropped his sarcastic tone upon recalling the harrowing story of the Tuiters of Majorca. His cheeks flamed and his eyes flashed with the effulgence of hatred. That they might dwell in tranquility, they had been converted en masse in the 15th century. There was not a Jew left on the island, but the Inquisition must do something to justify its existence, so there were burnings of persons suspected of Judaism in the Paseo del Born, spectacles organized, as said the chroniclers of the epoch, in accordance with the most brilliant functions celebrated by the triumph of the faith in Madrid, Palermo, and Lima. Some Tuiters were burned, others were beaten, others went out to their shame wearing nothing but hoods painted as devils and with green candles in their hands, but all of them had their goods confiscated and the Holy Tribunal was enriched. After that, those suspected of Judaism, those who had no clerical protector, were forced to go to Mass in the cathedral with their families every Sunday under the command and custody of an alguacil, who herded them as if they were a flock of sheep, put mantles on them so that no one could mistake them, and thus he took them to the temple amidst catcalls, insults, and stonings from the devout populace. This happened every Sunday, and in this unceasing weekly torment fathers died, sons grew into manhood, begetting new Tuiters destined to public contumely. A few families gathered together to flee from this degrading slavery. They met in an orchard near the sea wall, and were counseled and guided by one Raphael Varles, a valorous man of great culture. I don't know for sure that he was a relative of mine, said the captain. It was more than 2 centuries ago, but if he were not, I wish he had been. It would be an honor to have him for an ancestor. Adelante. Pablo Varles had collected papers and books of the epoch of persecutions, and he talked of them as if they had occurred but yesterday. Men, women and children took passage on an English ship, but a storm drove them back on the coast of Majorca, and the fugitives were taken prisoners. This was during the reign of Charles II, the Bewitched. To wish to flee from Majorca where they were so well treated, and more than that, on a ship manned by Protestants. They were held 3 years in prison, and the confiscations of their property yielded 1,000,000 duros. Besides this, the sacred tribunal counted upon more millions wrested from former victims, and constructed a palace in Palma, the finest and most luxurious possessed by the Inquisition in any land. The prisoners were subjected to torment until they confessed what their judges desired, and on the 7th of March, 1691, the executions began. That event has as its historian such a one as no other part of the world has ever known, Father Garau, a pious Jesuit, a fount of theological science, rector of the Seminary of Mount Sion, where the institute now stands, author of the Book of Faith Triumphant, a literary monument which I would not sell for all the money in the world. Here it is, it accompanies me everywhere. Out of his pocket he drew, the Faith Triumphant, a small book bound in parchment, of antique and reddish print, which he fondled with a ferocious grip. Blessed Father Garau, placed in charge of exhorting and encouraging the criminals, he had seen it all at close range, and he told of the thousands and thousands of spectators who flocked from many towns on the island to witness the festival, of the solemn masses attended by the 38 criminals destined for the burning, of the luxurious trappings of caballeros and alguacils mounted on prancing chargers at the head of the procession, and of the piety of the multitude, which burst into cries of pity when a highwayman was led to the gallows, but which remained dumb in the presence of these God-forgotten reprobates. On that day, according to the learned Jesuit, the temper of soul of those who believe in God and of those who do not was displayed. The priests marched courageously, uttering shouts of exhortation unceasingly, while the miserable criminals were pale, exhausted and fainting. It was easy enough to see on which side lay Celestial aid. The condemned were conducted to the foot of the castle of Belva for the final burning. The Marquis of Leganés, governor of the Milanesado, chancing to be in Majorca with his fleet, took pity on the youth and beauty of a girl sentenced to the flames, and sued for her pardon. The tribunal praised the Marquis for his Christian sentiments, but would not grant his petition. Father Garau was the one in charge of the conversion of Rafael Valls, a man of some letters, but one in whom the devil inspired an immeasurable pride, impelling him to curse those who condemned him to death, and refusing to reconcile himself with the Church. But, as the Jesuit said, such boastfulness, the work of the evil one, fails in the presence of danger, and cannot compare to the serenity of the priest who exhorts the criminal. The Jesuit father was a hero far from the flames. Now you shall hear with what evangelical pity he relates the details of the death of my ancestor. Opening the book at a marked page, he read impressively. As long as nothing but the smoke reached him, he stood like a statue. When the flames came, he defended himself, he tried to shield himself, he resisted until he could bear no more. He was as fat as a sucking pig, and, being on fire inside in such a way that even before the flames reached him, his flesh was becoming consumed like half-burnt wood, and bursting in his middle, his entrails fell out like a Judas. Crepuit medius diffusa sunt oninia viscera egis. This barbaric description always produced an effect. The laughter ceased, countenances darkened, and Captain Valls looked around with his amber-colored eyes, breathing satisfaction, as if he had achieved a triumph, while the small volume slipped back into his pocket. Once when Febra figured among his hearers, the sailor said to him rancorously, "You were there, too, that is, not yourself, but one of your ancestors, one of the Febras, who carried the green flag as the chief ensign of the tribunal, and the ladies of your family were in a carriage at the foot of the castle to witness the burning." Jamie, annoyed by this reminder, shrugged his shoulders. Things of the past. Whoever remembers what is dead and gone? No one but some crazy fellow like you. Come, Pablo, tell us something about your travels, about your conquests of women. The captain growled. Things of the past. The soul of the Roqueta was still the same as in those olden times. Odium of the Jewish religion and race still endured. For a good reason they dwelt apart, on this bit of ground isolated by the sea. But Valls soon recovered his good humor, and, like all men who have knocked about the world, he could not resist the invitation to relate his past. Febra, another vagabond like himself, enjoyed listening to him. They both had led a turbulent, cosmopolitan existence, different from the monotonous life of the islanders. They both had squandered money prodigally, but Valls, with the active genius of his race, had known how to earn as much as he had spent, and now, 10 years older than Jamie, he had enough to amply supply his modest bachelor needs. He still engaged in commerce occasionally, and he carried out commissions for friends who wrote to him from distant ports. Of his eventful history as a mariner, Febra disregarded the stories of hunger and storms, and only felt curiosity over his escapades in the great cosmopolitan ports where congregated the exotic vices and the women of all races. Valls, in his youth, when he was in command of his father's ships, had known women of every class and color, often finding himself involved in sailors' orgies, which ended in floods of whiskey and stabbing affrays. Pablo, tell us of your love affairs in Jaffa, when the Moors came near killing you. Listening to him, Febra laughed loudly, while the sailor said that Jamie was a good boy, worthy of a better fate, with no defect other than that of being a Butifarra somewhat given to the family prejudices. When he stepped into Febra's carriage on the road to Valdemosa, ordering his own to return to Palma, he pushed back the soft felt hat which he wore on all occasions, the crown crushed in, and the brim tilted up in front and down in the back. Here we are. Really, didn't you expect me? I heard the news. I've been told all about it, and since there is to be a family gathering, let it be complete. Febra pretended not to understand. The carriage entered Valdemosa, stopping in the vicinity of La Cartuja before a dwelling of modern construction. When the two friends opened the garden gate, they saw approaching a gentleman with white whiskers, leaning on a cane. It was Don Benito Valls. He greeted Febra with a weak, hollow voice, cutting short his words at intervals to gasp for air. He spoke humbly, laying great stress upon the honor which Febra showed him by accepting his invitation. "And how about me?" asked the captain, with a malicious smile. "Am I nobody? Aren't you glad to see me?" Don Benito was glad to see him. He said so several times, but his eyes revealed uneasiness. His brother inspired him with a certain fear. What a tongue he had! It were better that they should not meet. "We came together," continued the mariner. "Hearing that Jamie was breakfasting here, I invited myself, sure of giving you a great joy. These family reunions are delightful." They had entered the house. It was simply decorated. The furniture was modern and vulgar. Some chromos and a few hideous paintings representing scenes in Valdemosa and Miramar hung on the walls. Catalina, Don Benito's daughter, came down hurriedly. Her bosom was besprinkled with rice powder, revealing the haste with which she had given the last touch to her toilette on seeing the carriage arrive. Jamie had opportunity to study her appearance for the first time. He had not been mistaken in his conjecture. She was tall, with pale brown coloring, black eyebrows, eyes like drops of ink, and a light down on her lip and on her temples. Her youthful figure was full and firm, announcing a greater expansion for the future, as in all the women of her race. She seemed of a sweet and gentle disposition, a good companion, not likely to be in the way during the journey of a common life. She kept her eyes lowered, and her face flushed as she greeted Jamie. Her manner, her furtive glances, revealed the respect, the adoration of one who is abashed in the presence of a being whom she considers her superior. The captain caressed his niece with a certain familiarity, adopting that air of a gay old man with which he spoke to the common girls of Palma in the small hours of the night in some restaurant on the Paseo del Born. Ah, a smart girl, and how pretty she was. It seemed incredible that she came of a family of homely people. Don Benito directed them all into the dining room. Breakfast had been waiting for some time. In this house old customs were kept up, 12 o'clock sharp. They took their seats around the table, and Febra, who sat next to the host, was annoyed by his heaving respiration, by the sharp gasps which interrupted his words. In the silence which often reigns at the beginning of a dinner, the wheezing of his unsound lungs was painfully noticeable. The rich Chueta pursed his lips, rounding them like the mouth of a trumpet, and drew in the air with a disagreeable rattle. Like all sick people, he was eager to talk, and his sentences were long drawn out from a combination of stammering and pauses which left him with palpitating chest and eyes aloft, as if he were about to die of asphyxia. An atmosphere of uneasiness pervaded the dining room. Febra glanced at Don Benito in alarm, as if expecting to see him fall dead from his chair. His daughter and the captain, more accustomed to the spectacle, displayed indifference. "It is asthma, Don Jamie," laboriously explained the sick man. "In Valdemosa, I am better, in Palma, I would die." The daughter took advantage of the opportunity to put in her voice, which was like that of a timid little nun, contrasting strangely with her ardent, oriental eyes. "Yes, Papa is better here. You are more quiet in Valdemosa," added the captain, "and you commit fewer sins." Febra pictured to himself the torment of spending his life near that broken bellows. By good luck he might die soon. An annoyance of some months, but it did not alter his resolution of becoming one of the family. Courage. The asthmatic, in his verbose mania, spoke of Jamie's ancestors, of the illustrious Febras, the finest and noblest caballeros of the island. "I had the honor of being a great friend of your grandfather, Don Horatio." Febra looked at him in astonishment. It was a lie. Everyone in the island knew his grandfather, and he exchanged a few words with them all, but ever maintaining a gravity which imposed respect in others without alienating them. But as for being his friend, Don Horatio may have had business relations with the Chiueta relating to loans needed for propping up his fortune in its decline. I also knew your father very well, continued Don Benito, encouraged by Febra's silence. I worked for him when he was running for deputy. Those were different times from these. I was young, and had not the fortune which I have now. Then I figured among the Reds. Captain Vales interrupted him with a laugh. His brother was a conservative now and a member of all the societies in Palma. Yes, I am, shouted the sick man, choking. I like order, I like the old customs, and I think it right, for those who have something to lose to be in command. As for religion, religion, for that I would give my life. He pressed a hand against his breast, breathing painfully, as if choking with enthusiasm. He fixed aloft his pain-clouded eyes, adoring with a respect inspired by fear the sacred institution which had burned his forefathers alive. Pay no attention to Pablo, he gasped, turning to Febra when he had recovered breath. You know him, a wild-headed fellow, a Republican, a man who might be rich, but he won't have 2 pesetas in his pocket in his old age. Why not? Because you'll get him away from me. After this rude interruption by the sailor, silence fell. Catalina looked alarmed, as if she feared that the noisy scenes which she had often witnessed when the 2 brothers fell into an argument would be reproduced in Febra's presence. Don Benito shrugged his shoulders and addressed his conversation to Jamie. His brother was crazy, he had a good head, a heart of gold, but he was mad, stark mad. With his exalted ideas, and his loud talk in the cafes, it was largely his fault that decent people felt a certain prejudice against, that they spoke ill of. The old man accompanied his mutilated expressions with gestures of humility, avoiding the word Chiueta and refusing to name the famous street. The captain, flushing with contrition for his violence, desired his hasty words to be forgotten, and he ate voraciously, keeping his head lowered. His niece smiled at his good appetite. Whenever he ate at their table he amazed them with the capacity of his stomach. It is because I know what hunger is, said the sailor with a kind of pride. I have suffered real hunger, the kind of hunger that makes men think of the flesh of their companions. This reminiscence spurred him on to a vivid relation of his maritime adventures, telling of his younger days when he had been a supernumerary aboard a frigate which sailed to the coasts of the Pacific. When he insisted upon being a sailor, his father, the elder Vales, originator of the fortune of the house, had shipped him in a galley of his own which freighted sugar from Havana, but that was not a sailor's life because the cook reserved the best dishes for him. The captain dared not give him an order, seeing in him the son of the shipowner. At this rate he would never have become a real sailor, rugged and expert. With the tenacious energy of his race he had taken passage unknown to his father on a frigate bound for the Chinchas Islands for a cargo of guano, manned by a crew of many races, deserters from the English Navy, bargemen from Valparaiso, Peruvian Indians, black sheep of every family, all under command of a Catalonian, a niggardly ruffian, more prodigal with blows than with the mess. The outbound trip was uneventful, but on the return voyage, after passing the Straits of Magellan, they ran into the calms, and the frigate lay motionless in the Atlantic almost a month, and the store of provisions soon ran low. The miser of a ship owner had victualled the vessel with scandalous parsimony, and the captain, in his turn, had sailed with a scanty supply, appropriating to his own uses part of the money intended for stores. He gave us 2 sea biscuits a day, and those were full of worms. At first I used to busy myself scrupulously, like a well-brought-up boy, carefully picking out the little beasts, but after the house-cleaning, there was nothing left except bits of crust as thin as wafers, and I was starving. Then, "Oh, uncle," protested Catalina, guessing what he was going to say, and pushing away her plate and fork with a gesture of repugnance. "Then," continued the impassive sailor, "I gave up cleaning 'em out, and I swallowed them whole. It is true I ate at night, I've eaten lots of them, girl. Finally he only gave us 1 a day, and when I got back to Cadiz I had to go on a broth diet to get my stomach straightened out again." Breakfast being over, Catalina and Jamie strolled out to the garden. Don Benito, with the air of a kindly patriarch, told his daughter to take Senor Febra and show him some exotic rose bushes which he had recently planted. The 2 brothers remained in the room, which served as an office, watching the couple as they sauntered through the garden and finally seated themselves in the shade of a tree on 2 willow seats. Catalina replied to her companion's questions with the timidity of a Christian maiden, piously educated, guessing the purpose concealed in his brusque gallantry. This man had come on her account, and her father was the first to welcome the suggestion. A settled affair. He was a Febre, and she was going to tell him, yes. She thought of her youthful days in the college surrounded by poorer girls who took advantage of every opportunity to tease her, through envy of her wealth and hatred learned from their parents. She was a Chouette. She could only mingle with those of her own race, and even they, eager to ingratiate themselves with the enemy, played false to their own kind, lacking energy and cohesion for a common defense. When school let out, the Chouettes marched in advance, by order of the nuns, to avoid insults and attacks from the other pupils out on the street. Even the servants who accompanied the girls quarreled among themselves, assuming the odium and prejudices of their masters. In the boys' school also the Chouettes were dismissed first to escape the stonings and whippings of those who had longer been Christians. The daughter of Vals had suffered the torments of the treacherous pinprick, of the stealthy scratching, of the scissors in her braids, and then, on becoming a woman, the odium and scorn of her old-time companions had followed her, embittering the pleasures of the young woman despite her riches. What was the use of being elegant? On the avenues none but her father's friends bowed to her, in the theatre her box was visited only by people proceeding from the street. At last she must marry one of them, as her mother and her grandmothers had done. The despondency and mysticism of adolescence had urged her toward a monastic life. Her father almost choked with sorrow at the idea, but it was the call of religion, that religion to which she longed to devote her life. Don Benito consented to her entering a monastery in Majorca, where he could see his daughter every day, but not a convent would open its doors to her. The superiors, tempted by the father's fortune, which would in the end revert to the order, showed themselves favorably disposed, but the monastic flock rebelled at receiving into its bosom a girl from the street, and especially one who was not meek and resigned enough to submit to the superciliousness of the others, but rich and proud. When she was left thus in the world by the resistance of the nuns, she did not know how to plan her future, and she spent her life near her father, like a nurse, ignorant of what was to be her fate, turning her back upon the young Chouettes who fluttered about her, attracted by Don Benito's millions, until the noble Febre presented himself, like a fairy prince, to make her his wife. How good God is! She fancied herself in that palace near the cathedral, in the ward of the nobles, along whose silent, narrow, blue-paved streets grave cannons passed during the dreamy afternoon hours, summoned by the chime of bells. She imagined herself in a luxurious carriage among the pines on the mountain of Belva, or along the jetty, with Jamie at her side, and she reveled in the thought of the envious glances of her former companions, who would envy her, not only her wealth and her new position, but her possession of that man whom faraway adventures and a turbulent life had endowed with a certain halo of terrible seduction, dazzling and fatal to the quiet island senoritas. Jamie Febre. Catalina had always seen him at a distance, but when she whiled away her monotonous hours with incessant novel reading, certain characters, the most interesting on account of their adventures and daring, always reminded her of that noble from the ward of the cathedral who dashed about the world with elegant women dissipating his fortune. Then, suddenly, her father had spoken of this remarkable personage, giving her to understand that he was going to offer her his name, and with it the glory of his ancestors, who had been friends of kings. She did not know whether it were love or gratitude, but a wave of tenderness which dimmed her eyes drew her to the man. Ah, how she would love him! She listened to his words as to a sweet melody, not knowing what to say, intoxicated by its music, thinking at the same time of the future which he had suddenly opened to her, a rising sun bursting through the clouds. Then, making an effort, she concentrated her mind and listened to Febre, who was telling her about great foreign cities, of rows of luxurious carriages filled with women arrayed in the latest fashions, of broad stone steps in front of theatres down which came cascades of diamonds, ostrich plumes and nude shoulders, trying to place himself on a level of thought with the girl to allure her with these descriptions of feminine glory. Jamie said no more, but Catalina guessed the purpose which had inspired these words. She, the unhappy girl from the street, the Chouette, accustomed to seeing her people cringing and trembling beneath the weight of traditional odium, would visit these cities, would figure in the procession of riches, would have opened to her doors which she had always found closed, and she would pass through them leaning on the arm of a man who had ever seemed to her the personification of all terrestrial grandeur. "When shall I see all that?" murmured Catalina with hypocritical humility. "I am condemned to live on the island, I am a poor girl who has never harmed anybody, and yet I have suffered great annoyances, I must be repulsive." Febre rushed down the pathway which this feminine cleverness had opened for him. Repulsive. No, Catalina. He had come to Valdemosa solely to see her, to speak to her. He offered her a new life. All these things at which she marveled she could experience and taste with but a word. Would she marry him? Catalina, who had been waiting for an hour for this proposal, turned pale, tremulous with emotion. To hear it from his lips. She sat still for some time without answering, and at last stammered out a few words. It was a joy, the greatest she had ever known, but a well-educated girl like herself must not answer at once. I must have time. This is such a surprise. Jamie wished to insist, but at that very instant Captain Valls appeared in the garden, calling him vociferously. They must return to Palma. He had already given the driver orders to hitch up. Febra protested stubbornly. But by what right did that busybody mix into his affairs? Don Benito's presence cut off his protest. He was puffing painfully, with his face congested. The captain stirred about with nervous hostility, protesting at the coachman's delay. It was evident the brothers had been having a violent discussion. The elder one looked at his daughter, he looked at Jamie, and he seemed content in the belief that the two had reached an understanding. Don Benito and Catalina accompanied him as far as the carriage. The asthmatic clasped Febra's hand between his own with a vehement pressure. This was his house, and he himself a true friend desirous of serving him. If he needed his assistance he could dispose of him as he wished, just as if he were one of the family. He mentioned Don Horatio once again, recalling their former friendship. Then he invited Febra to breakfast with them 2 days afterward, without remembering to include his brother. "Yes, I will be here," said Jamie, giving Catalina a look which made her redden. When the garden gate, behind which stood the father and daughter waving their hands, was lost to view, Captain Valls burst into a noisy laugh. "So it seems that you would like to have me for an uncle of yours?" he questioned, ironically. Febra, who was furious at the intervention of his friend and the rudeness with which he had forced him to leave the house, gave expression to his choler. What business was it of his? By what right did he venture to meddle in his affairs? He was old enough not to need advisers. "Halt," said the sailor, leaning back in his seat and extending his hands near the musketeer's hat thrust on the back of his head. "Halt, my young gallant. I meddle in the affair because I am one of the family. I believe this concerns my niece, at least, so it looks to me. And what if I wished to marry her? Perhaps Catalina would think well of it, perhaps her father would consent. I don't say that he would not, but I am her uncle, and her uncle protests, and he says that this marriage is an absurdity." Jamie looked at him in astonishment. An absurdity to marry a Febra. Possibly he aspired to more for his niece. "An absurdity for them and an absurdity for you," declared Valls. "Have you forgotten where you live? You can be my friend, the friend of the Chueta, Pablo Valls, he whom you see in the cafe, in the casino, and whom folks consider half crazy, but as for marrying a woman of my family." The sailor laughed as he thought of this union. Jamie's relatives would be furious with him, and would never speak to him again. They would be more tolerant with him if he were to commit a murder. His aunt, the Poppus Juana, would scream as if she had witnessed a sacrilege. He would lose everything, and his niece, forgotten and tranquil until then, would give up the tediousness of her home, monotonous and sad, for an infernal life of misery, humiliation, and scorn. No, I say again, her uncle opposes it. Even the people of the lower classes who declared themselves enemies of the rich would be indignant at seeing a Butifarra marry a Chueta. The traditional atmosphere of the island must be respected, under penalty of death, as his brother Benito would die, for lack of heir. It was dangerous to try to change all at once the work of centuries. Even those who came from outside, free of prejudices, after a short time suffered this repulsion of race, which seemed to permeate the very atmosphere. Once, continued Valls, a Belgian couple came and established themselves on the island, bearing letters to me from a friend in Antwerp. I was attentive to them. I did all manner of favors for them. Be careful, I told them, remember that I am a Chueta, and the Chuetas are very bad people. The woman laughed. What barbarity! What out-of-date notions prevail here on the island! There were Jews everywhere and they were people like any other. After a while we met less frequently, they saw more of other people. At the end of a year they met me on the street and they glanced about in every direction before bowing to me. And now when they see me they always turn away their faces if they can, just the same as if they were Mexicans. Marriage. That was for a whole lifetime. In the first few months Jamie would try to face the murmurings and the scorn, but time runs on, and an odium dating from centuries does not wear out in the course of a few years, and finally Febra would regret his ostracism. he would realize his mistake in running counter to the traditions of the grand majority, and the one to suffer the consequences would be Catalina, looked upon in her own house as a type of ignominy. No, in matrimony no chances must be taken. In Spain it is indissoluble, there is no divorce, and making experiments results dear. That was why he had remained a bachelor. Febra, irritated at these words, reminded Pablo of his vigorous propagandas against the enemies of the Chuetas. But don't you desire the elevation of your people? Doesn't it make you furious to have the people from the street, looked upon as different from ordinary human beings? What could there be better than this marriage to combat the prejudice? The captain waved his hands in sign of doubt. Such a marriage would accomplish nothing. During several epochs of tolerance and momentary forgetfulness, some of the old-time Christians had married into the families of the people from the street. There were many on the island who revealed this mixture by their surnames. And what was the result? Odium and separation continued the same. No, not the same, a little more tempered than in other days, but latent still. The things which would end this situation were the culture of the people, new customs, and this would be the work of years, and would not be accomplished by a marriage. Besides, experiments were dangerous and caused victims. If Jamie were eager to make the test, let him choose someone besides his niece. Valls smiled sarcastically on seeing Jamie's negative gestures. "Are you enamored of Catalina?" he asked. The captain's amber-colored eyes, malicious and focused steadily on Jamie, would not permit him to lie. Enamored? No, not enamored, but love was not indispensable to marriage. Catalina was agreeable, she would make an excellent wife, a pleasant companion. Pablo grinned even more widely. "Let us talk like good friends, like men who know life. My brother is even more agreeable to you. No doubt he will set himself to arranging your business affairs. He will shed tears when he sees how much money you will cost him, but he has a mania for name, he respects and adores the past, and he will put up with anything. But don't trust him, Jamie. He is the type of those Jews represented in plays, with a fat pocketbook, helping people out in an hour of stress, but squeezing them afterward. They are the ones that discredit us. I am different. When he gets you into his power you will regret the business deal you have made." Febra looked at his friend with hostile eyes. The best thing he could do was to have no more to say about this matter. Pablo was a crazy fellow accustomed to saying whatever he thought, but he was not going to put up with it forever. If they were to continue friends, he must keep still. "Well, we'll keep still," said Valls. "But understand once and for all that the girl's uncle opposes you, and that he does it for your sake and for hers." They rode in silence the rest of the way. They separated on the Paseo del Born with a frigid bow, without a handclasp. Jamie returned to his house at dusk. Mammy Antonia had placed upon a table in the reception hall an oil lamp whose flame seemed to make the darkness of the vast room even more dense. The Avisons had just left. After breakfasting with her, and wandering about the city, they had waited until nightfall for the Senor. They must spend the night on the boat. The master of the vessel wished to set sail before sunrise. Mammy spoke with kindly interest of these people who seemed to her to have come from another side of the world. How they marveled at everything. They went about the island as if frightened, and Margalida. What a beautiful girl. Good old Mammy Antonia gave expression to one idea, but another persisted in her mind, and while she followed her master to his dormitory she looked him over with unconcealed curiosity, eager to read something in his face. What had taken place in Valdemosa, Virgin del Luque? What had become of that absurd plan of which the Senor had told her during breakfast? But her master was in an ill humor, and he responded to her questions with brief words. He was not going to remain in the house, he would dine at the casino. By the light of a lamp which but dimly illuminated his vast apartment, he changed his suit and brushed himself up a bit, taking an enormous key from Mammy's hands in order to open the door when he returned late at night. At 9 o'clock, on his way to the casino, he saw his friend Tony Clapes, the smuggler, standing in the doorway of an inn. He was a large man with a round, shaven face, in peasant garb. He looked like a country curate dressed as a farmer to spend the night in Palma. With his white hempen sandals, his collar minus a cravat, and his hat thrust back, he entered the cafes and clubs, being received with profuse manifestations of friendship. In the casino the men respected him for the calm way in which he drew handfuls of banknotes from his pockets. A native of a town in the interior, he had, by force of courage and dangers, become chief of a mysterious industry of which everyone had heard, but whose secret operations remained in shadow. He had hundreds of accomplices ready to die for him, and an unseen fleet which sailed by night, unafraid of storms, putting into port at inaccessible places. The worry and risk of these enterprises were never reflected in his jovial countenance nor in his generous impulses. He only seemed downcast when several weeks passed without news of some vessel which had sailed from Algiers in stormy weather. Lost, he would say to his friends. The bark and the cargo don't matter so much, but there were 7 men in her. I've sailed that way myself, I must see to it that their families don't lack bread. On other occasions his gloom was only pretended, with an ironic wrinkling of his lips. A government craft had just seized one of his vessels, and everyone laughed, knowing that nearly every month Tony allowed some old boat carrying a few bales of tobacco to be captured, to satisfy his pursuers by letting them boast of a triumph. When there was an epidemic in African ports, the authorities of the island, powerless to guard so extensive a coastline, sent for Tony, appealing to his patriotism as a Majorcan, and the contrabandist promised to cease his navigation for the time, or he loaded at another point to avoid spreading the contagion. Febre had in this rough man, light-hearted and generous, a fraternal confidence. He had often told him his troubles, seeking the advice of his rustic astuteness. He, who would never dream of soliciting a loan from his friends in the casino, in moments of stress accepted money from Tony which the contrabandist seemed to think no more about. They shook hands when they met. Had Febre been at Valdemosa? Tony had already heard about his trip, thanks to the facility with which the most insignificant news circulates through the calm, monotonous atmosphere of a Biscayan city open mouthed for gossip. They are saying something more, said Tony in his provincial Majorcan dialect, something that I can't believe. They say you're going to marry the Atlota of Don Benito Valls. Febre, surprised that the news had circulated so quickly, dared not deny it. Yes, it was true. He would acknowledge it to no one but Tony. The smuggler made a gesture of repulsion, while his eyes, accustomed to the greatest surprises, revealed astonishment. You are making a mistake, Jamie, a serious mistake. He spoke gravely, as if dealing with a solemn matter. The Butifarra maintained with this friend a confidence which he would not have risked with anyone else. But he was ruined, dear Tony. Nothing that remained in his house was his. His creditors only respected him in the expectation of this marriage. Tony shook his head with a negative expression. The rude native, the contrabandist who mocked at laws, seemed stupefied by the news. Any way you look at it, you are making a mistake. You should get out of your money troubles any way you can, but not this way. We, your friends, will help you. You marry a Chueta. He took leave of Febre with a vigorous handclasp, as if he imagined him in danger of death. You are making a mistake, think it over, he said with a reproachful expression. You are making a mistake, Jamie. Chapter 4. The Tyranny of the Dead. When Jamie got into bed 3 hours after midnight, he fancied he saw in the obscurity of his dormitory the faces of Captain Valls and Tony Clates. They seemed to be speaking to him as they had been doing the afternoon before. I oppose it, repeated the seaman with an ironic laugh. Don't do it, counseled the smuggler with a grave gesture. He had spent the evening at the casino, silent and ill-humored under the obsession of these protests. What was there so strange and absurd about his plan that it should be rejected by that Chueta, notwithstanding that it would be an honor to his family, and by that peasant, rude and unscrupulous, who lived almost beyond the pale of the law? It was true that this marriage would arouse scandal and protest on the island, but, what of that? Had he not a right to seek his salvation by any means? Was it perhaps a new idea for people of his class to try to re-establish their fortune by means of matrimony? How about the dukes and high-born princes who sought gold in America, giving their hand to daughters of millionaires of origin more censurable than that of Don Benito? Ah, that crazy Pablo Valls was right in a way. These alliances might be made in the rest of the world, but Majorca, the beloved Roqueta, still possessed a living soul, the soul of former centuries, filled with odium and prejudice. The people were such as they were born, such as their fathers had been, and thus they must continue to be here in this calm atmosphere of the island which was unstirred by new thoughts slowly wafted from the outside world. Jamie tossed restlessly in his couch. He was not sleepy. He thought of the Febres, and of their glorious past. How it weighed upon him, like a chain of slavery which made his misery keener. He had spent many afternoons in the archives of his house, in the apartment next to the dining room, opening the bronze doors of the cabinets and poring over the bundles of papers by the soft light filtering through the Persian blinds, dusty old papers which had to be shaken to keep them from being devoured by moths. barbarous letters of marque with erroneous and capricious profiles which had served the Febres in their early commercial campaigns. The whole array of them would barely bring in enough to eat for 2 days, and yet, the family had fought for centuries to make itself worthy this trust. How much dead glory! The true fame of his family, spreading beyond the borders of the island, began in 1541 with the arrival of the great emperor. An armada of 300 ships manned by 18,000 marines assembled in the bay on their way to the conquest of Algiers. Here were the Spanish infantry commanded by Gonzaga, the Germans under the Duke of Alva, the Italians led by Colonna, 200 knights of Malta at whose head marched the knight commander Don Priamo Febra, the hero of the family, while the whole fleet sailed under the orders of the famous Admiral Andrea Doria. With festivities in representation of mythologic scenes, Majorca welcomed the Lord of Spain and the Indies, of Germany and of Italy, who now happened to be suffering from gout and other infirmities. The flower of Castilian nobility followed the emperor on this holy enterprise and was duly lodged in the dwellings of the Majorcan caballeros. The house of Febra received as guest a parvenu noble, but recently risen from obscurity, whose achievements in a far-off country, and whose visible riches, aroused both enthusiasm and criticism. It was the Marquis del Valle de Oaxaca, Hernando Cortés, who, having just conquered Mexico, had come with the expedition in a galley equipped at his own expense, accompanied by his sons Don Martin and Don Luis, eager to figure now among the ancient nobles of the Reconquest as an equal. A royal magnificence distinguished this conqueror from distant lands, this possessor of fabulous wealth. 3 enormous emeralds valued at over 100,000 ducats decorated the bridge of his galley. One was cut in the form of a flower, another in the figure of a bird, and another was shaped like a bell, with an enormous pearl serving as a clapper. He was attended by persons who had been his companions overseas, and who had adopted exotic customs, slender hidalgos of sickly color who silently whiled away the time lighting bundles of herbs resembling pieces of rope, and puffing smoke out of their mouths like demons who were on fire within. The long line of Febra's grandmothers had handed down from generation to generation a great uncut diamond, a souvenir from the heroic captain given in return for their gracious hospitality. The precious stone was described in the family documents, but Don Horatio's grandfather had not had the pleasure of seeing it, since it had disappeared during the course of centuries, as had so many riches swept away by the financial troubles of an ostentatious house. The Febres prepared refreshments for the Armada, in the name of Majorca, defraying most of the expenses themselves. In order to arouse the emperor's appreciation of the abundance and productiveness of the island, this refreshment included 100 beeves, 200 sheep, hundreds of pairs of chicken and peacocks, hundreds of quarteras of oil and flour, hundreds of quarterones of wine, more hundreds of quarterolas of cheese, capers, olives, 20 bottles of Arion, and 4 quintals of white wax. Moreover, the Febres resident on the island and not members of the Order of Malta, embarked in the squadron with 200 Majorcan gentlemen, eager to conquer Algiers, that nest of pirates. The 300 galleys sailed out of the bay, their pennants streaming, accompanied by salutes discharged from cannons and bombards, cheered by the multitude crowded upon the walls. Never had the emperor gathered together so imposing a fleet. It was October. The able Doria was in bad humor. According to him there existed no other safe ports in the Mediterranean than June, July, August and Marne. The emperor had delayed too long in Tyrol and Italy. The Pope, Paul III, when he came out to meet him at Lucca, had prophesied misfortunes due to the lateness of the season. The expedition disembarked on the shore of Hama. The knight commander Febra, with his caballeros of Malta marched in the vanguard, sustaining incessant onslaughts from the Turks. The army took possession of the heights surrounding Algiers and began the siege. Then Doria's predictions were fulfilled. A frightful storm arose with all the violence of the African winter. The troops, without shelter, drenched to the bone during the night of the torrential rain, were stiff with cold. A furious wind compelled the men to lie flat upon the ground. At sunrise, the Turks, taking advantage of this situation, fell suddenly upon the army, which became demoralized and scattered, but the knight commander Priamo, a demon of war, insensible alike to either cold or fire, vigorous, aggressive and untiring, restrained the advance with a handful of his caballeros. Spaniards and Germans rallied. Pursued by the besiegers, the Turks had to fall back to the very walls of Algiers, and Don Priamo Febra, wounded in the face and in the leg, dragged himself to the city gates and thrust his dagger deep into one of its panels in testimony of his attack. In another sally against the Moors, the onset was so furious that the Italians were driven back, the Germans following their example, and the emperor, flaming with fury at seeing his favorite soldiers in retreat, unsheathed his sword, called for his colors, set spurs to his war horse, and shouted to the brilliant retinue of caballeros that followed him, "Forward, gentlemen! If you see me fall with the flag, save it before you do me." The Turks fled before the charge of this squadron of iron. A Febre from the island, entitled "The Rich," a remote ancestor of Jamie's, had twice rushed in between the emperor and the enemy, saving his life. At the exit of a narrow defile, the fire from the Turkish culverins decimated the cavalry. The Duke of Alva grasped the bridle of his monarch's horse. "Sire, your life is more important than a victory." And the emperor, growing calmer, turned back, and with a stately gesture of gratitude removed the gold chain from about his neck and hung it upon the shoulders of Febre. Meanwhile, the storm wrecked 160 vessels, and the remainder of the fleet was forced to take refuge behind Cape Matafo. The majority of the nobles agreed upon an immediate retreat. Hernando Cortés, the Count of Alcordat, governor of Oran, and the Majican gentlemen, with the Febres at their head, begged the emperor to save himself and to let the army carry forward the expedition alone. At last a retreat was decided upon, and over mountain summits and through rain-swollen streams, they achieved their sorrowful purpose, continually accosted by the enemy, leaving killed and prisoners in their wake. In the teeth of the storm those who were able boarded the ship, the raging sea swallowed up 9 more vessels, and the Majican galleys sailed mournfully into the Bay of Palma convoying the emperor who left for the peninsula without landing in Majorca. The Febres returned to their house covered with renown even in defeat, one bearing the golden testimonial of the Caesar's friendship, the other, the knight commander, lying on a litter, cursing like a pagan because the blockading of Algiers had been discontinued. Priamo Febre. Jamie could not think of him without sympathy and curiosity aroused by the tales he had heard in his youth. His was the heroic, and also the unconventional soul of the family. The ancient dames of the house never mentioned his name. On hearing it they lowered their eyes and blushed. Although a soldier of the church, a holy knight who had taken the vow of chastity on entering the order, he always carried women in his galley, Christian women ransomed from the Mussulman, who were in no haste to return to their homes, or else infidels captured on his audacious buccaneering expeditions. When it came to a division of the booty, he looked with indifference upon the pile of riches, leaving them for the Grand Master of the order. He was only interested in appropriating the women. If threatened with excommunication, he laughed impishly in the faces of the ecclesiastics of the order. If the Grand Master sent for him to administer a reproof for his carnality, Febre would straighten himself arrogantly, reminding him of the glorious victories on the sea which the Cross of Malta owed to him. Some of his letters, bundles of yellow paper with reddish characters, faded and indistinct, were written in a style which revealed the knight commander's lack of learning. He expressed himself with soldierly fluency, mixing religious phrases with the most shameless expressions. His name was known along the whole Mediterranean coast where dwelt the infidels. The Mohammedans feared him as they feared the devil. Moorish mothers hushed their babes with threat of the knight commander Febre. Dragut, the great Turkish corsair, considered him the only rival worthy of his valor. Each feared and respected the other, and, after several engagements in which both were wounded, they endeavored to avoid meeting, either on land or sea. One day Dragut, on visiting a galley of his fleet anchored off Algiers, found Priamo Febre, half naked, chained to a seat with an oar in his hands. "Casualties of war," exclaimed Dragut. "Casualties of fortune," replied the knight commander. They clasped hands and said no more. One did not offer favor, nor did the other ask for mercy. The people of Algiers flocked to see the Maltese demon, now become a slave and fastened to a bench, but when they beheld him as fierce and glowering as a captive eaglet they dared not insult him. The order paid as ransom for its heroic warrior hundreds of slaves, ships, and cargoes, as if he were a prince. Years afterward, Don Priamo, upon entering a Maltese galley found the intrepid Dragut in turn chained to a rower's seat. The scene was repeated in reverse, with no sign of surprise from either, as if the event were perfectly normal. They clasped hands. "Casualties of war," said Febre. "Casualties of fortune," replied the other. Jamie liked the knight commander because he had represented in the bosom of the noble family lawlessness, license, scorn of convention. What cared he for difference of race and religion when he fancied a woman? When this noble ancestor had come to middle life he retired to Tunis among his good friends the rich corsairs, who, once hating and fighting him, now at last became his comrades. Of this period of his existence little was known. Some thought that he had become a renegade, and that as a diversion he even gave chase on the sea to the galleys from Malta. Enemies of his, gentlemen of the order, swore to having seen him during a battle, dressed as a Turk, in the forecastle of a hostile ship. The only positive fact was that he lived in Tunis in a palace on the seashore with a Moorish woman of splendid beauty, a relative of his friend the Bey. 2 letters in the archives testified to this incomprehensible liaison. When the Muslim woman died, Don Priamo returned to Malta, deeming his career ended. The highest dignitaries of the order desired to favor him if he would amend his conduct, and they talked of appointing him commander of the Order of Malta at Negroponte, or else Great Castellan at Imposta, but the incorrigible Don Priamo would not better his ways, and continued a libertine, crusty, fickle in disposition toward his companions, but a beloved hero to his brothers in arms, men of the ranks belonging to the order, mere soldiers who could display over their cuirasses no other decoration than that of the half-cross. Scorn for their intrigues, and the hatred of his enemies, caused him to abandon the archipelago of the order, the islands of Malta and Gozo, ceded by the emperor to the warrior friars for no other price than the annual tribute of a goshawk such as a native to the island. Old and worn, he retired to Majorca, living off the products of the estates belonging to his commandery situated in Catalonia. The impiety and the vices of the hero horrified the family and scandalized the island. 3 young Moorish girls and a Jewess of great beauty were his companions in the guise of servants, where they occupied a whole wing of the Febra mansion, which was much larger at that time than today. Moreover, he kept several male slaves. Some were Turks, others Tartars. These shook with fear whenever they saw him. He had dealings with old women who were held to be witches. He consulted Hebraic healers. He shut himself up in his dormitory with these suspicious characters, and the neighbors trembled at seeing his windows glow with an infernal fire in the small hours of the night. Some of his male slaves grew pale and languid as if their lives were being sucked away. The people whispered that the Knight Commander was using their blood for magic drinks. Don Priamo wished to renew his youth. He was eager to reanimate his body with vital fires. The Grand Inquisitor of Majorca hinted at the possibility of paying a visit, with familiars and alguazils, to the apartments of the Knight Commander, but the latter, who was a cousin of the Inquisitor, communicated by letter his intention of knocking open his head with a boarding pike if he ventured to so much as set foot on the first step of his stairway. Don Priamo died, or rather he burst under pressure of his diabolical beverages, leaving as a testimonial of his freedom from bias a will, the copy of which Jamie had read. The warrior of the church willed the main portion of his property, as well as his weapons and trophies, to his elder brother's children, as had likewise done all the second sons of the house, but in continuation there figured a long list of legacies, all for children of his whom he declared begotten of Moorish slave women or of Jewess friends, Armenians and Greeks, vegetating, wrinkled, and decrepit, in some port of the Levant, an offspring like that of a patriarch of the Bible, but all irregular. Hybrid, the product of the crossing of hostile blood of antagonistic races. Famous Knight Commander. It seemed as if on breaking his vows he tried to minimize the offense by always choosing infidel women. To his sins of carnality was added the shame of traffic with females hostile to the true God. Jamie looked upon him as a precursor who cleared away his doubts. What was strange about his marrying a Chouetta, a woman like others in her customs, beliefs, and education, since the most famous of the Febres in an epoch of intolerance had lived beyond the pale of the law with infidel women. Suddenly, however, family prejudices provoked in Jamie a twinge of remorse, causing him to recall a clause in the Knight Commander's will. He left legacies to the children of his slave women, hybrids of other races, because they were of his blood and he wished to shield them from the sufferings of poverty, but he prohibited them from using their father's name, the name of the Febres, which had always been kept legally free from degrading admixtures in their Majorcan house. Recalling this, Jamie smiled in the darkness. Who could answer for the past? What mysteries might not be hidden at the roots of the trunk of his origin, back in the medieval times, when the Febres and the rich of the Balearic synagogue trafficked together and loaded their ships in Puerto Pi. Many of his family, and even he himself, with other members of the ancient Majorcan nobility, had something Jewish in their faces. Purity of race was an illusion. The life of nations depends upon constant change, the great producer of mixtures and assimilations. But, the proud family scruples. The dividing lines created by custom. He himself, though pretending to jest at the prejudices of the past, experienced an irresistible feeling of haughtiness in the presence of Don Benito, who was to become his father-in-law. He considered himself superior, he tolerated him with condescending courtesy, he had mentally revolted when the rich Chouetta spoke of his pretended friendship for Don Horatio. No, the Febres had never mingled with these people. When his ancestors were in Algiers with the emperor, Catalina's forefathers were probably shut up in the ward of Calatrava, making objects of silver, trembling at the thought that peasant farmers might descend upon Palma under pretext of war, groveling, white with terror, before the great Inquisitor, undoubtedly some Febre, to gain his protection. Outside, in the reception hall, hung the portrait of one of his less remote ancestors, a Senor with shaven face, fine colorless lips, white wig, and red silk coat, who, according to a memorandum on the canvas, had been perpetual governor of the city of Palma. King Carlos III sent a royal ordinance to the island prohibiting the insulting of the old-time Jews, an industrious and honorable people, threatening with penalty of imprisonment whosoever should call them chuetas. The island council sniffed at this absurd order of the too-kind monarch, and Governor Febre settled the matter with the authority of his name. File the ordinance, it will be noted, but it will not be complied with. Why should the chuetas be given respect like any one of us? They are content so long as their pockets and their women are not touched. Then they all laughed, saying that Febre spoke from experience, for he was extremely fond of visiting the street, giving work to the silversmiths so as to be able to talk to their women. In the reception room there was also another ancestral portrait, that of the Inquisitor Don Jaime Febre, whose name he bore. In the garrets of the house he had found several visiting cards yellowed by time, bearing the name of the rich priest, cards engraved with emblems such as came into use in the 18th century. In the center of the card appeared a wooden cross, with a sword and an olive branch, on both sides two pasteboard coronets worn as a mark of infamy by those on whom punishment was to be inflicted, one with the cross of the sacred office, another with dragons and Medusa heads. Manacles, whips, rosaries, and candles completed the decoration. Below burned a bonfire around a post with a large iron ring, and there figured a conical hat decorated with serpents, toads, and horned heads. A sort of sarcophagus rose between these decorations, and on it was inscribed in ancient Spanish lettering, "The Senior Inquisitor, Don Jaime Febre." The peaceful Magican who, on returning to his house, found this visiting card, must have felt his hair rise in terror. Another of his ancestors came into his mind, the one mentioned by the choleric Pablo Valls when he recalled the burning of the chuetas and Father Garo's little book. He was an elegant and gallant Febre, who had kindled enthusiasm among the ladies of Palma at the famous auto da fe, with his new suit of Florentine cloth, embroidered in gold, mounted upon a charger as sightly as his master, carrying the standard of the sacred tribunal. In flights of lyric rapture the Jesuit described his genteel bearing. At sundown the night had seen, there near the foot of the castle of Belva, how the corpulent bulk of Raphael Valls had burned, and how his entrails had burst out and fallen into the coals, a spectacle from which the presence of ladies distracted his attention, making his horse caracole near the doors of their carriages. Captain Valls was right, it was barbarous, but the Febres were his kindred, his name and the fortune he had squandered he had owed to them. Now he, the last descendant of a family proud of its history, was about to marry Catalina Valls, the offspring of the executed Jew. The old wives' tales he had heard in childhood, the simple stories with which Mammy Antonia used to entertain him, now surged through his mind like dreams of the past, which had made a deep impression. He thought of the chuetas, who, according to popular opinion, were not the same as other people, reputed to be creatures of sordid poverty and slimy to the touch, who, no doubt, concealed terrible deformities. Who could say that Catalina was like other women? Then his thoughts turned to Pablo Valls, so merry and generous, the superior of nearly every other friend Jaime possessed on the island, but Pablo had lived little in Majorca. He had traveled widely, he was not like those of his race, working stationary like automatons in the same posture for centuries, reproducing themselves in their cowardice, lacking courage and unity to compel respect. Jaime knew rich Jewish families in Paris and in Berlin. He had even solicited loans from the lofty barons of Israel, but as he came into contact with these true Hebrews who clung to their religion and their independence, he did not feel that instinctive repugnance aroused by the devout Don Benito and other chuetas of Majorca. Was it atmosphere which influenced him? Was it that centuries of submission, and fear, and the habit of cringing, had made of the Jews of Majorca a different race? Febre at last sank into the darkness of sleep, with these thoughts whirling through his troubled mind. While dressing next morning, he decided, by a great effort of the will, to make a certain call. This marriage was something extraordinary and risky, which demanded long reflection, as his friend the smuggler had pointed out. Before taking the step I must play my last card, thought Jaime. I'll go and see the Popeswana. I haven't seen her for many years, but she is my aunt, my nearest relative. In justice, I ought to be her heir. Ah, if only that idea would occur to her. If she would only bestir herself all my troubles would be over. Jaime decided upon the most advantageous hour to visit the great lady. In the afternoon she held her famous salon of canons and austere gentlemen whom she received with the airs of a sovereign. These were to be the inheritors of her money, as agents and representatives of various corporations of a religious character. He must visit her immediately, surprise her in her solitude after Mass and morning prayers. Dona Juana lived in a palace near the cathedral. She had remained unmarried, abominating the world after certain deceptions in her youth for which Jamie's father had been responsible. All the combativeness of her irascible disposition, and the zeal of her cold and haughty faith, she had dedicated to politics and religion. For God and for the king, Febre had heard her say, on visiting her once when he was a boy. In her youth she had dreamed of the heroines of Vendée, she had been aroused by the heroic deeds and sufferings of the Duchess of Berry, and was eager, like those forceful women, devoted to their legitimate rulers and to religion, to mount a war horse, wearing an image of Christ on her breast, with a saber hanging by her side. This desire, however, did not pass beyond vague dreams. In reality she had been on no other expedition than a trip to Catalonia, during the last Carlist War, to see at closer range the sacred enterprise which was absorbing a great part of her wealth. The enemies of the Poppus Juana declared that the young woman had kept concealed in her palace the Count of Montemolin, a pretender to the crown, and that she had drawn him into conspiracy with General Ortega, Captain General of the islands. To these rumors were added tales of the romantic love of Dona Juana for the pretender. Jamie smiled on hearing this gossip. It was all a lie. Don Horatio's grandfather, who had known the whole story, often mentioned these matters to his grandson. The Poppus Juana had loved no other than Jamie's father. General Ortega was a deluded person whom Dona Juana received with extraordinary show of mystery, gowned in white, in a darkened salon, talking in a sweet voice which seemed to come from beyond the tomb, as if she were an angel of the past, concerning the necessity of turning Spain back to its ancient customs, sweeping away the liberals, and re-establishing the government of Caballeros. For God and for the king. Ortega was shot on the coast of Catalonia when his Carlist expedition failed, and the Poppus remained in Majorca, ready to bestow her money upon new pious enterprises. Many thought that she was ruined after her prodigality during the last civil war, but Jamie knew what a fortune the devout lady possessed. She lived as simply as a peasant, she still owned extensive estates, and the money she had saved by her economies went in the form of gifts to churches and convents and in donations to St. Peter's treasury. Her old-time motto, for God and for the king, had suffered mutilation. She no longer thought of the king. Nothing was left of her former enthusiasm for the exiled pretender except a great daguerreotype with a dedication adorning the darker part of her salon. A fine young man, she used to say, but like all liberals. Ah, life in a foreign land. How it changes men. What sins. Now her enthusiasm was only for God, and her money made its way to Rome. One supreme hope dominated her life. Would not the Holy Father send her the Golden Rose before she died? It was a gift originally intended for none but queens, but some pious rich women of South America had received this distinction, and Juana gave a detailed account of her liberalities, living in holy poverty so that she might send still more money. The Golden Rose, and then she would be ready to die. Febre arrived at the dwelling of the Poppus, a zaguin resembling his own, but better kept, cleaner, with no grass between the paving stones, no cracks nor broken places in the wall, but all in monastic pulchritude. The door was opened to him by a servant, young and pale, dressed in a blue habit with a white cord, who made a gesture of surprise on recognizing Jamie. She left him in the reception hall among a concourse of portraits, such as that in the house of the Febres, and she ran with a light, rat-like trot to the interior rooms to announce this extraordinary visit which disturbed the monastic peace of the palace. Long moments of silence followed. Jamie heard furtive footsteps in the adjoining apartments, he saw curtains which swayed lightly, as if moved by a gentle zephyr, he felt lurking forms behind them, unseen eyes spying upon him. The servant reappeared, bowing low to Jamie with grave courtesy, for was he not the Signora's nephew? She left the great salon and disappeared. Febre amused himself while waiting by looking over the vast room, with its archaic luxury. His own house had been like this in his grandfather's time. The walls were covered with rich crimson damask forming a background for the ancient religious paintings in soft, Italian style. The furniture was of white and gilded wood, with voluptuous curves, upholstered in heavy embroidered silk. Polychrome figures of saints and 18th-century hangings with mythological scenes were reflected in the deep azure mirrors above the consoles. The vaulted ceiling was painted in fresco, with an assemblage of gods and goddesses seated on clouds, whose rosy nudity and bold gestures contrasted sharply with the dolorous visage of a great Christ which seemed to preside over the salon, occupying a wide space on the wall between two doors. The Papist recognized the sinfulness of these mythological decorations, but as they were reminiscent of a happy epoch, of a time when the caballeros ruled, she respected them, and tried not to see them. A damask curtain parted, and a woman who looked like an old servant entered the salon, dressed in black, wearing a plain skirt and a poor jacket, after the manner of a peasant woman. Her grey hair was partly concealed by a dark shawl to which time and grease had imparted a reddish tint. Beneath her skirt peeped 4 feet shod in hempen sandals, with coarse white stockings. Jamie hastily arose. That old servant was the Papist. The chairs were arranged in a certain disorder, which suggested the coterie which gathered there every afternoon. Each seat belonged by right of habit to a certain grave person, and stood motionless in its own particular place. Dona Juana occupied a great throne-like chair, from which seat she presided every afternoon over her faithful reunion of canons, old woman friends, and senoras of wholesome ideas, like a queen receiving her court. "Sit down," she said to her nephew curtly. She extended her hands, in the automatism of custom, across a monumental empty silver brazier, and stared at Jamie fixedly with her piercing grey eyes so accustomed to commanding respect. This authoritative stare gradually began to soften until it weakened in tears of emotion. She had not seen her nephew for nearly 10 years. "You are a true Febre. You look like your grandfather, like all of the men of your family." She concealed her real thoughts. She kept silent about the only resemblance which moved her, his likeness to his father. Jamie was the young naval officer, just as he used to come to see her in the old days. He lacked nothing but the uniform and the eyeglasses. Ah, that monster of liberalism and of ingratitude. Soon her eyes recovered their accustomed hardness, her features became more dry, more pale and angular. "What do you wish?" she said rudely, "because you certainly have not come merely for the pleasure of seeing me." The moment had arrived. Jamie lowered his eyes with childish hypocrisy, and, afraid of broaching his actual desires, he began his attack in a roundabout manner. He explained that he was good, that he believed in all the old ideals, that he desired to maintain the prestige of his family and to add to it. He had not been a saint, he confessed it, a wild life had consumed his wealth, but the honor of the house remained intact. This life of sin and wickedness had given him 2 things, experience, and the firm intention to mend his ways. "Aunt, I want to change my way of living, I want to become a different man." The aunt assented with an enigmatic gesture. "Very well." Thus St. Augustine and other holy men who had spent their early lives in licentiousness, changed their ways and had become luminaries of the Church. Jamie felt encouraged by these words. He certainly would never figure as a luminary of anything, but he desired to be a good Christian gentleman. He would marry, he would educate his children to carry on the traditions of the house, a beautiful future. But, alas, lives as irregular as his were difficult to patch up when the moment came to direct them toward virtuous ends. He needed help. He was ruined, his lands were almost in the hands of his creditors, his house was a desert, he had protected himself by selling the mementos of the past. He, a Febre, was about to be thrust into the street, unless some merciful hand should assist him, and he had thought of his aunt, who, when all was said and done, was his nearest relative, almost like a mother, in whom he trusted to save him. The imaginary motherhood caused Dona Juana to flush slightly, and augmented the hard glitter in her eyes. "Ah, memory, with its haunting visions. And is it from me you hope for salvation?" slowly replied the Papist in a voice that hissed between the yellow rows of her parted teeth. "You are wasting your time, Jamie. I am poor. I have almost nothing, barely enough to live on and to make a few gifts to charity." She said it with such an accent of firmness that Febre lost hope and realized that it would be useless to insist. The Papist would not help him. "Very well," said Jamie with visible discouragement. "But, lacking your assistance, I must seek another solution for my troubles, and I have one in view. You are now the head of my family, and it is right for me to seek your advice. I am considering a marriage which can save me, an alliance with a rich woman, but one who does not belong to our class, one of low origin. What ought I to do?" He expected in his aunt a movement of surprise, of curiosity. Perhaps the announcement of his marriage would soften her. It was almost certain that, terrified at this great danger to the honor of her house and of her blood, she would smooth the way for him by conceding assistance, but the one to be surprised, to be dismayed, was Jamie as he saw the pale lips of the old woman part in a cold smile. I have heard, she said. I was told all about it this morning in Santa Eulalia as I was coming away from Mass. You were at Valdemosa yesterday. You are going to marry, Achueta. It cost her an effort to pronounce the word, she shuddered as she spoke it. After this a long silence reigned, one of those tragic and absolute silences which follow great catastrophes, as if the house had just tumbled down, and the echo of the last toppled wall had died away. And what do you think of it? Jamie ventured to ask timidly. Do as you wish, said the Pappas with frigidity. You remember that we have lived many years without seeing each other, and we can go on in the same way for the rest of our lives. Do as you please. Henceforward you and I will be like people of different blood, we think along different lines, we cannot understand each other. So I ought not to marry? He insisted. Ask yourself that question. For many years the Febres have wandered on such crooked paths that nothing they do surprises me. Jamie detected in his aunt's eyes and noted in her voice a repressed joy, a reveling in vengeance, the satisfaction of seeing her enemies fall into what she considered a dishonor, and this irritated him. But if I marry, he said, imitating Dona Juana's frigid manner, will you come to my wedding? This put an end to the tranquility of the Pappas, who drew herself up haughtily. The romantic books of her youth rushed through her mind, she spoke like an injured queen at the end of a chapter of a historic novel. Caballero, I am a Genevart on my father's side. My mother was a Febra, but one family is as good as the other. I renounce the blood that is to be mixed with a vile people, Christ killers, and I remain true to my own, to that of my father which will end with me pure and honorable. She pointed toward the door with arrogant mien, bringing the interview to a close, but soon she seemed to realize how abrupt and theatrical her protest had been, and she lowered her eyes, she grew more human, assuming an air of Christian meekness. Goodbye, Jamie, may the Lord enlighten you. Goodbye, Aunt. Impelled by custom he extended his hand, but she drew hers back, concealing it behind her. Febra smiled as he recalled certain tales told by the gossips. It was not scorn nor hatred. The Pappas had made a vow that as long as she lived she would touch the hand of no man except those of the priests. When he found himself again on the street, he began to curse mentally, looking at the swelling balconies of the Rococo mansion. Rattlesnake! How she rejoiced at his marriage! When it had become a fact she would pretend indignation and scandal before her coterie, perhaps she would get sick so that all the islanders would sympathize with her, and yet, her joy would be great, the joy of a vengeance nourished for many years, on seeing a Febra, the son of the man she hated, submerged in what she considered the most ignominious of dishonors. Urged on by the certainty of ruin, he must give her this joy by carrying into effect his union with the daughter of Vals. Ah, poverty! He wandered along the solitary streets near the Almudena and the cathedral until past midday. At last hunger instinctively turned his steps homeward. He ate in silence, without knowing what was put before him, not even seeing Mammy, who, worried and restless since the previous day, was eager to start a conversation in order to learn more news. After luncheon he stepped out upon a small gallery with a crumbling balustrade crowned by 3 Roman busts which looked into the garden. At his feet spread the foliage of the figs, the varnished leaves of the magnolias, the green balls on the orange trees. Before him the trunks of the palms shut off the blue of space, and, farther away, the sharp-pointed melons of the wall extended to the sea, the luminous, immense sea, trembling with life as if the barkentines with their wind-filled sails were tickling its greenish surface. At his right lay the port crowded with masts and surrounded with yellow chimneys, beyond, striding into the waters of the bay, the dark mass of the pines of Belva, and on the summit the circular castle like a bull ring, with its torre de Homenaya apart, isolated, with no other link than a graceful bridge. Below lay the modern red houses of Terreno, and beyond, at the end of the cape, the ancient Puerto Pi with its signal towers and the batteries of Don Carlos. Across the bay, losing itself in the sea, amid the fog floating upon the horizon, was a dark green cape with reddish rocks, gloomy and desolate. Against the blue sky the cathedral lifted its buttresses and arcades like a ship of stone bereft of masts, flung by angry waves between the city and the shore. Behind the temple the ancient Alcazar, the Almudena, flaunted its red, Moorish, almost windowless towers. In the bishop's palace the glass panes in the miradors shone like flames of reddened steel, as if reflected from a conflagration. Between this palace and the sea wall, in a deep, grass-grown fosse along whose walls crept wind-swept garlands of rosebushes, lay some cannons, a few of them very ancient and mounted upon wheels, others more modern, which had awaited for years the call to action, were scattered over the ground. The great iron guns were oxidized, as were the gun carriages, The long-range cannons, painted red, and sunken in the herbage, resembled exhaust pipes of a steam engine. Neglect and the rust of disuse were aging these modern pieces. The traditional, monotonous atmosphere which, according to Febra, enveloped the island, seemed to weigh upon these instruments of war, old and out of date almost before they were fashioned, and before ever having spoken. Insensible to the joyousness of the sun, heedless of the luminous palpitation of the blue expanse, deaf to the chirping of the birds fluttering at his feet, Jamie was overcome by intense sadness, by overwhelming depression. Why struggle with the past? How rid himself of the chain? At birth everyone found the place and the gesture for everything in the course of his existence already defined. It was useless even to wish to change one's situation. Often in his early youth, on looking down from a height upon the city with its smiling environs, he had felt obsessed by gloomy thoughts. In the sunshine-flooded streets, under shelter of the roofs, swarmed an ant-like humanity, dominated by necessities and ideas of the moment which they considered all-important, believing with consuming egotism in a superior and omnipotent being watching and directing their goings and comings, as insignificant as the infusoria in a drop of water. Beyond the town, Jamie's imagination pictured cypress tops thrust above sombre walls, the white structures of a compactly built city, multitudes of tiny windows like the mouths of ovens, and marble slabs which seemed to cover the entrances to caves. How many were the inhabitants of the city of the living, in their plazas and on their broad streets? 60,000, 80,000. Ah! In that other city but a short distance away, crowded, silent, packed into their little white houses beneath the gloomy cypresses, the invisible inhabitants numbered 400,000, 600,000, perhaps a million. In Madrid, the same thought had flashed through his brain one afternoon while he was strolling with two women through the outskirts of the town. The crests of the hills near the river were occupied by silent villages, among whose white edifices rose pointed groups of cypress, and on the opposite side of the great city also existed other bivouacs of silence and oblivion. The city was surrounded by a closely drawn cordon of fortresses of the departed. 500,000 living beings swarmed through the streets, imagining themselves alone in the mastery and direction of their existences, never heeding the 4, 6, 8 millions of their kind, close beside them, but invisible. The same thought had come to him in Paris, where 4 millions of stirring citizens dwelt, surrounded by 20 or 30 millions of whilom inhabitants now asleep. The same melancholy reflections had haunted him in all the great cities. The living were nowhere alone, the dead ever surrounded them, and as the dead were more, infinitely more, they weighed upon the living with the heaviness of time and of numbers. No, the dead did not depart, as the people thought. The dead remained motionless on the brink of life, spying upon the new generations, forcing upon them the authority of the past with a rude tug at the soul whenever they tried to step out of the beaten path. What tyranny was theirs! What unlimited power! It was futile to turn away the eyes and to stifle memory. The dead are everywhere, they occupy the highways of the living, and they stride out to meet us and remind us of their benefactions, compelling us to a debasing gratitude. What servitude! The house in which we live was constructed by the dead, religions were created by them, the laws which we obey the dead dictated. Our favorite dishes, our tastes, our passions, came from them, the foods which nourish us, all are produced by earth broken up by hands which now are dust. Morality, customs, prejudices, honor, these are their work. Had they thought in some different way, the present organizations of men would not be as they are today. The things which are agreeable to our senses are so because thus the dead willed them, the disagreeable and useless are detested by the will of those who no longer exist, what is moral and what is immoral are sentences pronounced centuries ago by them. Those men who make an effort to say new things do nothing but repeat in different words the same thoughts that the dead had been expressing for centuries. That which we consider most spontaneous and personal in ourselves has been dictated to us by unseen masters lying in their earthen couches, who, in their turn, had learned the lesson from other ancestors. The gleam of our eyes is but the glow of the souls of our forefathers, as the lines in our faces reproduce and reflect the traces of generations long disappeared. Febra smiled sadly. We imagine that we think our own thoughts, while in the convolutions of our brain stirs a force which has lived in other organisms, like the sap of the grafted shoot which carries energy from old and dying trees to new offshoots. Much of the thought which we express spontaneously, as the latest novelty of our mind, is an idea of those others, insisted in our brain at birth, and which suddenly bursts its bondage. Our tastes, our caprices, our virtues and our defects, our affinities and our repulsions, all inherited, all a work of those who have disappeared but who survive in us. With what terror Jamie thought of the power of the dead. They concealed themselves to make their tyranny less cruel, but they had not really perished. Their souls were lying within the confines of our existence, just as their bodies formed an entrenched field round about the man-made towns. They scrutinized us with arbitrary eyes, they followed us, guiding us with invisible clutch at the slightest indication of deviating from the path. They banded together with diabolic determination to lead the flocks of men who rush after some new and extraordinary ideal, re-establishing with violent reaction the order of life, which they love, silent and placid, amid rustle of dried grasses and the flutter of butterfly wings and the sweet peace of the cemetery, asleep in the sun. The souls of the dead fill the world. The dead do not go away, they remain as masters. The dead command, and it is useless to resist. The man of the great cities living a giddy life, knowing not who built his house, nor who makes his bread, seeing no other works of nature than the stunted trees adorning his streets, ignores these things. He does not even realize that his life is spent among millions and millions of his forefathers crowded together but a few steps away, spying upon him and directing him. He blindly obeys their tugging, without knowing where leads the cord fastened upon his soul. Poor automaton, he believes all his acts to be the product of his will, when they are nothing less than impositions of the omnipotent invisible horde. Jamie, submerged in the monotonous existence of a tranquil island, thinking back upon his forefathers one by one, knowing the origin and history of all that surrounded him, objects of art, clothing, furniture, and the house itself which seemed possessed of a soul, could give account of this tyranny better than could others. Yes, the dead command. The authority of the living, their startling novelties, illusion, deception, serving only to carry forward existence. Gazing on the sea, on whose horizon the smoke from a steamer traced a slender column, Febvre thought of the great transatlantic liners, floating cities, speeding monsters, the pride of human industry, which can make the round of the world in a few short weeks. His remote ancestors in the Middle Ages who went to England in a ship no better than a fishing smack, represented something more extraordinary, and the great captains of the present time with their swarming crews, had not achieved greater deeds than the Knight Commander Priamo with his handful of sailors. What deceptions, what illusions, we form concerning life, to conceal from ourselves the monotony of its shams. The brevity of its experiences was maddening. It mattered not whether one lived 30 years or 300. Men perfected the playthings which served their egoism and their well-being, machines, means of locomotion, but aside from this, they lived the same. The passions, the joys, and the sorrows were the same, the human animal did not change. Jamie had believed himself a free man, with a soul which he called modern, his, all his, and now he discovered in it a confused medley of the souls of his ancestors. He could recognize them, because he had studied them, because they were in the next room, in the archives, like dried flowers preserved between the leaves of an old book. The majority of humans retained at the most a memory of their great-grandfathers. Families which had been unable to scrupulously preserve the history of their past through the centuries gave no heed to the ancestral life perpetuated in their souls, taking as inspirations of their own the cries which their ancestors uttered through them. Our flesh was flesh of those who no longer exist, our souls combined fragments of the souls of many dead men. Jamie felt within him his austere grandfather, Don Horatio, and along with him the animosities of the Inquisitor General, he of the appalling visiting card, and the souls of the famous Knight Commander and other ancestors. In the mind of the man of today still lingered something of that perpetual governor, who considered the Jewish converts on the island as a separate and degraded race. The dead command. Now he understood the inevitable repugnance, the arrogance he had felt as he came into contact with the obsequious and humble Don Benito. Those sentiments were unconquerable, and his aversion irremediable. It was imposed upon him by others stronger than himself. The dead command, and they must be obeyed. His pessimism caused him to reflect upon his present condition. All was lost. He was unfitted for the conduct of a small business, for the petty transactions and details which might suffice for one of meager wants. He would renounce the idea of that marriage which was his only salvation, and his creditors, as soon as they heard the news that this hope had vanished, would fall upon him. He would find himself expelled from the house of his forefathers, pitied by everybody, with a pity that would sting more keenly than insult. He felt himself unequal to witness the final wreck of his house and of his name. What could he do? Where should he go? He sat staring at the sea for a great part of the afternoon, watching the white sails until they hid themselves behind the cape, or vanished into the broad horizon of the bay. Leaving the terrace without knowing how, Febvre found himself opening the door of the chapel, an old and forgotten door, which, as it creaked upon its rusty hinges, scattered dust and cobwebs. How long it had been since he had entered there. In the dense atmosphere of the closed room he thought he perceived a vague odor of essences, as from a bottle of perfume opened and long abandoned, an odor which brought back to his memory the solemn dames of the family whose portraits hung in the reception hall. In the ray of light filtering through the tiny windows of the cupola, millions of dust motes illuminated by the sun danced in an ascending spiral. The altar, with its antique carving, glowed faintly in the mellowed light with reflections of old gold. Upon it lay a duster and a pail, carelessly left since the last cleaning of the room, many years ago. 2 prayer stools of old blue velvet seemed to still retain the impression of lordly and delicate forms which no longer existed. 2 prayer books with worn edges lay upon the rack before them, as if forgotten. Jamie recognized one of the books. It had belonged to his mother, poor lady, pale and sick, who divided her life between praying and the adoration of her son, for whom she dreamed an illustrious future. The other, perhaps, had belonged to his grandmother, that Mexican lady of the days of Romanticism, who still seemed to thrill the great house with the rustling of her white garments and the melody of her harp. The apparition from the past, vague and dim, arising in the deserted chapel, the memory of those 2 ladies, the one all piety, the other all idealism, aristocratic and dreamy, drove Febre to distraction. To think that soon the rude hands of the usurer would profane so much that was old and venerable. He could not stay to witness it. Goodbye, goodbye. At dusk he sought out Tony Clates in the Bourne. With the confidence which the contrabandist inspired in him he asked him for money. I don't know when I can return it. I am leaving Majorca. Everything is going to ruin, but I must not stay to see it. Clates gave Jamie more money than he asked for. Tony was to stay a while on the island, and with the help of Captain Valls he would try to straighten out Jamie's business affairs, if it was still possible. The captain was a good businessman, and he knew how to disentangle the most hopeless complications. He and Jamie had quarreled the day before, but that was no matter. Valls was a true friend. Don't tell anyone that I am going away, added Jamie. No one must know it but you, and Pablo. You are right, he is a friend. And when are you leaving? On the first steamer for Iviza. Jamie still had something left there, a pile of rocks covered with thickets and full of rabbits, a crumbling tower belonging to the time of the pirates. He had learned of it by chance the day before. Some peasants from Iviza whom he had met in the Bourne had reminded him of it. I shall be as well off there as anywhere else, better, much better. I will hunt and fish. I am going to live where I cannot see people. Clates, remembering the advice he had given the evening before, grasped Jamie's hand with satisfaction. That affair of the Chueta girl was a thing of the past. His peasant soul rejoiced at this solution. You were right in going. The other thing would have been an act of madness. End of Part 1. Part 2. Chapter 1. Iviza. Febre was contemplating his image, a transparent shadow of quivering contours on the changing waters, through which the bottom of the sea could be seen with milky spots of clean sand and dark blocks of stone broken from the mountain overgrown with a strange vegetation. The seaweed floated backward and forward like waving green hair, fruits round as Indian figs hung in whitish clusters on the rocks, pearly flowers shone in the depths of the green waters, and among the mysterious growth starfishes spread their colored points. Sea urchins formed balls like dark blots covered with spines. The hippocampi, those little devil's horses, swam restlessly, and flashes of silver and purple, of tails and fins, passed swiftly among whirlpools and bubbles, dashing out of one cave to disappear into the mouth of another unfathomable mystery. Jamie was leaning over a small boat, with its sail dropped. In one hand he held the volantee, a long line with several hooks, which almost reached the bottom of the sea. It was nearly midday. The craft lay in the shade. In the rear extended the wide coast of Iviza with its broad sinuosities of projecting points and steep shores. Before him was the Vedra, an isolated rock, a superb landmark 1,000 feet in height, which, standing solitary, seemed even higher. At his feet the shadow of the Colossus imparted to the waters a dense and yet transparent color. Beyond its azure shadow seethed the Mediterranean, flashing with gold in the sunlight, while the coasts of Iviza, ruddy and lonely, seemed to irradiate fire. Every pleasant day Jamie came to the narrow channel between the island and the Vedra to fish. In calm weather this was a river of blue water with submarine rocks which peeped their black heads above the surface. The giant allowed itself to be approached without losing its imposing appearance, harsh and inhospitable. When the wind blew fresh and strong, the half-submerged